Hey there, and welcome back to another journey through forgotten history. Tonight, we're stepping through the swinging doors of a Texas saloon in the 1870s. But this isn't the sanitized Hollywood version you've seen 1,000 times. This is the real story, the one that's been waiting in the shadows of dusty frontier towns, written in whiskey stains and boot scuffs on weathered wooden floors. You might think you know what a Wild West saloon was like. The dramatic showdowns, the heroic sheriffs, the gleaming bars with perfectly polished glasses. But what if I told you that the most famous gunfight in saloon history never actually happened the way you think it did? What if the real story involved a widow who ran the toughest establishment in Texas, a mysterious stranger who carried more than just secrets in his saddlebags, and a night that changed everything, not with bullets, but with something far more powerful? Tonight, we're going to discover why travelers would ride 100 miles just to sit at one particular bar. We'll uncover the secret ingredient that made certain saloons legendary. And it wasn't the whiskey. We'll meet the people who built these places with their bare hands and defended them with their lives. And we'll learn why, when the dust finally settled on the American frontier, it was these smoky, noisy, dangerous rooms that became the beating heart of civilization itself. So, pour yourself something warm, dim the lights, and let the soft sounds of the evening settle around you. Because we're about to spend the next 3 hours in a place where dreams were won and lost on the turn of a card, where strangers became family over shared meals, and where the future of America was being written one story at a time. Let's step back into the fading light of a Texas evening in 1873 and discover what really happened when the sun went down on the frontier. Chapter 1. When the sun kisses the horizon. The first thing that strikes you about a Texas frontier town at dusk isn't what you'd expect. It's not the dramatic silhouettes against fiery sunsets that painters love to capture. It's the dust. Fine, persistent dust that hangs in the air like a golden curtain, catching the last rays of sunlight and turning the entire world into something soft and dreamlike. Picture yourself standing at the end of Main Street in Millerville, Texas, a town that existed for barely 15 years but lived more fully in that time than some places do in centuries. The year is 1873, and you've just stepped off the weekly stagecoach, your body still vibrating from 2 days of bone-jarring travel across rough prairie roads. The wooden storefronts stretch before you like theater sets, their false fronts making modest single-story buildings appear grand and substantial. But as the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, transforming the sky into layers of orange and pink, these buildings take on a different character entirely. The harsh edges of midday soften. Shadows pool in doorways and beneath the wide porches that front every establishment. And there, at the heart of it all, stands the Lone Star Saloon. You can spot it immediately, not because it's the largest building, though it is, but because it's alive in a way the others aren't. Light spills from its windows like liquid gold, and even from a distance, you can hear the gentle murmur of voices, the soft scrape of chairs, the muffled notes of a piano being played with more enthusiasm than skill. But here's what the movies never show you about these frontier saloons. They weren't the chaotic, violence-filled dens of iniquity that popular culture would have you believe. Most nights, they were more like, well, imagine your neighborhood coffee shop. If your neighborhood coffee shop also happened to serve as the post office, the hotel lobby, the restaurant, the bank, the newspaper office, and the town square all rolled into one. The Lone Star was owned and operated by a woman named Margaret Maggie O'Sullivan, though if you'd asked anyone in Millerville who really ran the place, they would have told you it was a partnership between Maggie and the building itself. because that saloon had a personality as distinct as any person who walked through its doors. As twilight deepens and you approach those famous swinging doors, and yes, they really did have swinging doors, though they served a practical purpose you might not expect, you begin to notice the details that made this place special. The wide porch doesn't just provide shade. It's designed to catch the prevailing evening breeze, creating a natural cooling system that makes the interior comfortable even on the hottest summer nights. The lanterns hanging from the porch posts aren't just for light. They're positioned to cast shadows that provide privacy for conversations while still illuminating faces enough for recognition. And those swinging doors? They allow air to circulate while keeping dust from blowing directly inside, and they let sound carry without requiring people to shout over closed barriers. Every design choice was intentional, born from years of experience and the hard-won wisdom of people who understood that comfort and practicality weren't luxuries on the frontier. They were necessities for survival. But as you pause on that porch, hand raised to push through those doors, you hear something that stops you cold. A woman's voice, clear and strong, rising above the general conversation. "I'm telling you, Samuel, that man who rode in this afternoon, there's something about him that doesn't sit right. The way he looked at the register, the questions he asked about the bank schedule." A man's voice responds, lower, harder to make out. "Maybe so, Maggie, but we can't turn away paying customers just because they make us nervous. Half the men in Texas would make us nervous if we judged them by—" "That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it. This is different. I've been running this place for 8 years, and I can tell when a man's running from something. Question is, what happens when it catches up to him?" You lean closer to the door, curiosity overcoming politeness. But before you can hear the response, a hand falls on your shoulder. "First time at the Lone Star, stranger?" You turn to see a tall man with graying temples and eyes that have seen too much, but somehow retained their kindness. A silver star gleams on his vest. The town marshal, you realize, though he wears it with the casual authority of someone who rarely needs to use it. "Yes, sir," you reply. "Just arrived on the evening stage." Marshal Williams, for that's who this is, though you won't learn his name for several more minutes, nods toward the doors. "Then you're in for a treat. Maggie runs the finest establishment between here and San Antonio. Just remember, whatever you hear tonight, whoever you meet, whatever stories get told, well, let's just say the Lone Star has a way of changing people. Question is, are you ready to be changed?" Before you can answer, he's pushing through those swinging doors, and you have no choice but to follow. The interior hits you like a warm embrace. The first sensation is the smell. Not the stale beer and unwashed bodies you might expect, but something far more complex and welcoming. Wood smoke from the fireplace mingles with the aroma of fresh bread and simmering stew from the kitchen. There's the sweet scent of pipe, tobacco, the warm smell of leather and oil from well-maintained boots and holsters, and underneath it all, the clean scent of soap and lavender that suggests this place is kept far cleaner than its rough exterior might indicate. The second sensation is the sound, a gentle symphony of human activity. Conversations flow at a comfortable volume, punctuated by the soft clink of glasses, the rustle of cards being shuffled, and the occasional scrape of a chair being pushed back from a table. The piano player, a thin man with quick fingers and a gap-toothed smile, is working through a gentle melody that somehow manages to fill the spaces between conversations without overwhelming them. But it's the third sensation that really captures you, the feeling of belonging. because everyone who enters the Lone Star, from the most hardened cattle rustler to the most refined lady from back east, is greeted with the same genuine welcome. Not the forced hospitality of someone trying to separate you from your money, but the natural warmth of people who understand that civilization, real civilization, is built one human connection at a time. Maggie O'Sullivan approaches you before you've taken 3 steps inside, and you understand immediately why this place has the reputation it does. She's not a large woman, but she commands space like someone twice her size. Her dark hair is swept back in a practical style. Her dress is well made, but designed for work rather than show. And her eyes. Her eyes hold the kind of intelligence that comes from dealing with every type of person the frontier can produce. "Welcome to the Lone Star," she says, and her voice carries just a hint of the Irish accent that betrayed her origins. "I'm Maggie O'Sullivan, and this is my place. You look like a man who's traveled far and has stories to tell. Find yourself a table, and Sarah will be by with the evening special. Tonight it's beef stew with cornbread, and I guarantee you won't find better this side of Austin." She pauses, studying your face with the practiced eye of someone who's learned to read people quickly and accurately. "And if you're planning to stay the night, we've got clean rooms upstairs with real mattresses and fresh linens. Most folks find the Lone Star grows on them after a night or 2. As she moves on to greet other new arrivals, you realize she's given you far more information than just the evening's menu. She's told you that stories are valued here, that comfort is available, and that this isn't the kind of place where people just pass through. It's the kind of place where they stay, where they put down roots, where they build the connections that turn a collection of buildings into a real community. But as you settle into a table near the window, you can't shake the memory of that conversation you overheard on the porch. A mysterious stranger, questions about the bank, and Maggie's obvious concern about what might be catching up to him. You find yourself scanning the room, wondering which of these ordinary-looking men might be the one who's brought danger to this peaceful haven. And in that moment, you realize something important about frontier saloons that Hollywood never quite captured. They weren't just places where violence happened. They were places where violence was prevented, where potential conflicts were diffused through conversation, where strangers were turned into neighbors, where the raw edges of frontier life were smoothed by human warmth and understanding. But they were also places where the past had a way of catching up to the present, where secrets couldn't stay hidden forever, and where one wrong move could shatter the carefully maintained peace. The evening has only just begun, and already you can sense the undercurrents of drama that will unfold before the night is through. But first, let's understand how places like the Lone Star came to exist and why they became so essential to survival on the Texas frontier. Chapter 2. Built by hand, strengthened by will. To understand the Lone Star Saloon, or any frontier saloon for that matter, you have to understand how these places came to exist in the first place, because they weren't built by corporations or wealthy investors looking for quick profits. They were born from necessity, built by hand, and strengthened by the collective will of people who understood that civilization isn't something that's imposed from above. It's something that grows from the ground up, one relationship at a time. Maggie O'Sullivan hadn't set out to become a saloon owner. In 1865, she'd been Margaret Kelly, the young wife of Patrick O'Sullivan, a carpenter from County Cork, who'd brought his bride to Texas with dreams of building a ranch. They'd settled in what would eventually become Millerville with nothing but a wagon, 2 horses, and Patrick's set of well-maintained tools. The first structure Patrick built wasn't their house. It was a workshop where he could take on carpentry jobs for other settlers. He had a vision, you see. He believed that if he could establish himself as the finest craftsman in the region, people would travel from miles around to commission his work. And once they were traveling to his workshop, they'd need a place to stay, a place to eat, a place to rest their horses and conduct their business. So the second structure he built was a simple frame building with a wide porch and a stone fireplace. Nothing fancy, just solid construction designed to last. The downstairs would serve meals to travelers, the upstairs would provide clean lodging, and the small room behind the kitchen would be their private quarters. Patrick O'Sullivan never got to see his vision fully realized. In the winter of 1866, he was thrown from his horse during a sudden storm and never regained consciousness. Maggie found herself 23 years old, alone on the frontier, with an unfinished building and no obvious way to support herself. What happened next says everything you need to know about the kind of people who built the American West. The men of the growing community, cowboys, farmers, miners, drifters, could have simply taken over Patrick's property, could have claimed it for unpaid debts or found legal loopholes to force his widow back east. Instead, they finished building it for her, not out of charity, but out of enlightened self-interest. They needed what Patrick had envisioned, a place to gather, to eat, to conduct business, to find companionship at the end of long, lonely days. But they also needed Maggie specifically, because in a world where most women were sheltered from the harsh realities of frontier life, she had already proven herself capable of managing the practical details that kept a community functioning. She could keep books, negotiate with suppliers, settle disputes, and somehow maintain the kind of warmth and civility that made brutal circumstances bearable. So they built the Lone Star Saloon, though it wouldn't acquire that name for another 2 years, according to Patrick's original plans, but with modifications suggested by Maggie's practical experience. The bar was positioned so the person behind it could see both the front door and the kitchen. The main room was designed with sightlines that prevented concealed weapons or hidden conversations. The upstairs rooms each had 2 exits, and the staircase was built wide enough for quick movement but positioned so it couldn't be easily defended by someone trying to control access. These weren't architectural flourishes. They were survival features, born from hard experience with the realities of frontier life. The walls were built from local timber, but they were double-walled with an air gap for insulation. The windows were positioned to catch cross breezes for natural cooling, but they were also sized and placed to provide clear fields of view in all directions. The wide porch served as an outdoor dining area during pleasant weather, but it also provided a neutral ground where potentially hostile parties could meet without the psychological pressure of being cornered inside. But the real genius of the design was something you couldn't see: the acoustic engineering. The main room was built with proportions that allowed normal conversation to flow naturally while preventing individual words from being overheard at distant tables. This meant that private business could be conducted publicly without sacrificing confidentiality, and it also meant that potentially inflammatory discussions were less likely to involve innocent bystanders. By the time the building was complete in the spring of 1867, it had become clear that Maggie's establishment would be something unprecedented on the frontier, a public house in the truest sense of the term. Not just a place where people came to drink and gamble, but a place where the business of building a community was conducted. The first official saloon license was issued in Texas in 1867, and Maggie was among the first to apply. But her application was unlike any other submitted that year. Instead of simply requesting permission to sell alcoholic beverages, she proposed to operate what she called a public accommodation house that would serve alcohol as part of a broader range of services. She would provide meals to travelers and locals. She would maintain clean lodging for overnight guests. She would serve as an unofficial post office, holding mail for transients and forwarding messages between widely scattered settlements. She would provide a neutral meeting ground for business negotiations, legal proceedings, and social gatherings. And yes, she would serve alcohol, but always as part of a meal or social activity, never as the primary purpose of a visit. The territorial authorities had no precedent for such a request, but they were practical men who understood that frontier communities needed gathering places if they were going to survive and prosper. They approved Maggie's application, and in doing so, they created the legal framework for what would become the classic American frontier saloon. But legal approval was just the beginning. The real challenge was creating an atmosphere that would attract the right kind of customers, while discouraging the wrong kind. Maggie's solution was brilliantly simple. She made the Lone Star a place where people wanted to bring their families. This might seem contradictory. How could a saloon be family-friendly? But Maggie understood something that most saloon owners missed. The men who worked the cattle drives, the mining claims, the railroad construction sites weren't just seeking alcohol and entertainment when they came to town. They were seeking connection to the civilized world they'd left behind, reminders of home and family and community. So the Lone Star became a place where cowboys could sit down to a meal that reminded them of their mother's cooking, where miners could play cards for matchsticks instead of gold dust while sharing stories of their families back east, where traveling salesmen could find an audience for their tales of distant cities and their wares from the outside world. The key was the staff Maggie assembled. Sarah Martinez was the first person Maggie hired, a young widow whose husband had been killed in a mining accident. Sarah had 2 small children and no obvious means of support. But she had something Maggie recognized as invaluable: the ability to make strangers feel like family. Sarah would remember your name after a single introduction, ask about your health if you'd been ill, and somehow always know exactly when you needed conversation and when you needed to be left alone. Tom Phillips was the second hire, a former soldier who'd lost his left arm in the final months of the Civil War. Tom became the day bartender, and his military bearing and obvious competence with his remaining hand made him exactly the kind of employee who could maintain order without violence. Men respected Tom not despite his disability, but because of his refusal to let it define him. The third employee was perhaps the most important: Carlos Reyes, a 15-year-old boy whose family had been killed in an Apache raid. Carlos spoke 4 languages fluently: English, Spanish, Apache, and the sign language used by Plains tribes. And he had an encyclopedic knowledge of every trail, water source, and seasonal pattern within 200 miles. Maggie made Carlos her official information broker, the person travelers consulted for everything from weather predictions to trade route conditions to tribal movements. Together, this small staff transformed the Lone Star from a simple business into the beating heart of the growing community. But they also created something else: a target, because success on the frontier always attracted attention, and not all of that attention was welcome. By 1870, the Lone Star was generating more revenue than any other business in the territory, and that kind of prosperity inevitably drew the interest of people who preferred taking to building. The first serious threat came in the form of Marcus Dodge, a man who claimed to represent a consortium of investors from back east. Dodge arrived in Millerville with official-looking papers and a convincing story about plans to modernize and expand the community's commercial district. All he needed, he explained, was for certain existing businesses to sell their properties to his consortium at fair market prices. Maggie's first instinct was to refuse outright, but Carlos had overheard conversations suggesting that Dodge wasn't as legitimate as he appeared. So, instead of giving him a direct answer, she invited him to experience the Lone Star's hospitality as her guest while she considered his generous offer. What happened over the next 3 days became the stuff of local legend. Dodge had expected to find a crude frontier drinking establishment that could be easily dismissed or intimidated. Instead, he found himself in the middle of a sophisticated social network that operated according to rules he didn't understand and couldn't manipulate. On his first morning, Dodge attempted to intimidate Tom Phillips by making disparaging comments about disabled veterans. Tom's response was to quietly pour Dodge a cup of coffee, set it exactly where Dodge could reach it without stretching, and say, "Mr. Dodge, I lost this arm defending the principle that all Americans deserve to pursue their dreams without interference from people who think might makes right. I'd be happy to discuss that principle with you if you're genuinely interested." On his second day, Dodge tried to pressure Sarah Martinez into revealing details about the saloon's finances. Sarah's response was to serve him a meal so expertly prepared and presented that he found himself asking for the recipes instead of demanding business information. On his third day, Dodge made the mistake of suggesting to Carlos that a smart boy could make good money providing inside information to the right people. Carlos's response was delivered in fluent English, Spanish, Apache, and sign language simultaneously, ensuring that every customer in the saloon understood exactly what kind of man Dodge was and what he was trying to do. By the time Dodge left Millerville, his consortium had been exposed as a confidence scheme, and his threats had united the community against exactly the kind of outside interference that could destroy places like the Lone Star before they had a chance to grow into something permanent. But that victory taught Maggie something important. The Lone Star's greatest strength, its role as the community's social center, was also its greatest vulnerability. Because if something happened to disrupt the delicate balance she'd created, if violence or scandal drove away the families and legitimate businessmen who were her core customers, then the saloon would quickly degenerate into exactly the kind of place she'd worked so hard to avoid becoming. Which brings us back to that mysterious stranger and Maggie's concern about what might be catching up to him. As you sit at your table, watching the easy interaction between staff and customers, observing the way conversations flow naturally from business to pleasure to gossip and back again, you begin to understand that you're witnessing something remarkable, a functioning democracy in miniature. Every person in this room has a voice, every opinion carries weight, and every individual's welfare affects the welfare of the whole. But you also begin to understand that this carefully maintained equilibrium could be shattered by a single wrong move, a single moment of violence, a single betrayal of the trust that holds everything together. And somewhere in this room, if Maggie's instincts are correct, is a man whose past is about to collide with everyone's future. Chapter 3. The Democracy of the Bar Rail. There's a moment in every frontier saloon, usually around the time the evening meal is finishing, and before the serious gambling begins, when you can see democracy in its purest form. Not the formal democracy of voting booths and legislative chambers, but the essential democracy of human beings figuring out how to share space, resources, and stories without killing each other. At the Lone Star, this moment typically arrived around 8 o'clock, when the last of the dinner plates had been cleared and Tom Phillips had begun wiping down the bar with the slow, methodical movements of a man who understood that ritual could be as important as efficiency. The piano player. You'd learned his name was Jimmy Kelligan, and he'd lost 2 fingers on his right hand in a railroad accident, which explained the unique style of his playing. Would shift from the gentle background melodies that accompanied dinner to the livelier tunes that encouraged conversation and community. It was during this transition that you began to understand the real genius of what Maggie O'Sullivan had created. Because a frontier saloon wasn't just a business, it was a social institution that served functions no other establishment could provide. In a world where most people lived isolated lives on scattered homesteads and ranches, The saloon provided the human contact that prevented civilization from fragmenting into a collection of hermits and recluses. But more than that, it provided a space where social hierarchies could be temporarily suspended, where a cattle baron and a cowhand could share the same bar rail, drink from the same bottle, and participate in the same conversations on roughly equal terms. Not because wealth and status didn't matter in the larger world, but because the saloon operated according to different rules. Rules based on storytelling ability, gambling skill, personal courage, and the kind of practical intelligence that kept you alive on the frontier. Tonight's gathering was typical in its diversity, but unusual in its underlying tension. As you nursed your second beer and listened to the conversations flowing around you, you began to piece together the cast of characters who made the Lone Star their regular evening destination. At the far end of the bar stood Colonel James Morrison, though everyone called him simply Colonel, and most had forgotten he'd earned the title during the Mexican War, rather than the more recent conflict between the states. The colonel owned the largest spread in 3 counties, employed more than 50 cowboys and vaqueros, and could have bought and sold the entire town of Millerville without putting a serious dent in his fortune. But tonight he was sharing bar space with Miguel Santos, a former vaquero who'd saved enough money to start his own small ranch, and Billy Thompson, a 19-year-old cowhand who earned $30 a month when work was available. In most social settings, these 3 men would have had nothing to say to each other. Here, they were engaged in an animated discussion about the relative merits of different horse breeds for winter work. "The thing about Mustangs," the colonel was saying, gesturing with his whiskey glass, "is that they've got the endurance for long drives, but they don't have the temperament for close work around cattle. You want a horse that can think for itself, but still follow orders." Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "My father, he always said the best cow horses are the ones that are smart enough to be lazy. They don't waste energy, but when they need to move, they move fast, and they move right." Billy, who'd been listening with the intensity of a young man who understood that he was receiving an education worth more than money, leaned forward. "What about those quarter horses Davidson's been breeding up north? I heard they can turn on a dime and give you 9 cents change." The conversation continued, touching on breeding lines, training techniques, and the subtle art of reading an animal's character. But what struck you was the dynamic between the 3 men. The colonel had the most experience and resources, but he listened respectfully to Miguel's observations, which came from a different tradition of horsemanship, and both older men treated Billy not as a subordinate to be instructed, but as a colleague whose opinions and questions were worthy of serious consideration. This was frontier democracy in action, a meritocracy based on practical knowledge rather than inherited position, where a man's worth was measured by what he could do rather than where he came from. But it was also fragile, dependent on everyone understanding and respecting the unwritten rules that made such interactions possible. Rules that could be shattered by violence, betrayal, or the kind of outside pressure that turned neighbors into enemies. At a table near the window, a different kind of conversation was taking place. Judge Harrison Reed, the circuit judge who visited Millerville once a month to handle legal matters, was sharing a bottle of Maggie's best whiskey with Dr. Samuel Mitchell, the town's only physician, and Father Miguel Rodriguez, the Catholic priest who ministered to the area's growing Hispanic population. These 3 men represented the formal institutions of frontier civilization: law, medicine, and religion. But their conversation revealed how different those institutions looked in practice from their theoretical ideals. "The problem," Judge Reed was saying, "isn't that people don't respect the law. It's that they don't trust it to be fair, or fast, or relevant to their actual problems. A man steals another man's horse, and the injured party knows he can track down the thief and recover his property in 2 days. Or he can wait 6 months for me to arrive, file formal charges, impanel a jury, and hope the thief doesn't disappear in the meantime. Dr. Mitchell refilled his glass and shook his head. Same with medicine. People would rather trust folk remedies and common sense than wait for professional treatment that might not be any better than what their grandmother would prescribe. And half the time, their grandmother's remedies work better than what I learned in medical school. Father Rodriguez smiled wryly. At least you two deal with problems that have practical solutions. I'm supposed to provide spiritual guidance to people whose daily lives require them to make moral compromises that would horrify the theologians back in seminary. Is it a sin to shoot a man who's trying to steal your cattle? Is it wrong to water your whiskey if watering it means you can keep your prices low enough for working men to afford? Is gambling immoral if it's the only entertainment available for hundreds of miles? The judge leaned back in his chair. Maybe the real question is whether formal institutions like law, medicine, and religion can adapt to frontier conditions, or whether frontier conditions will create entirely new institutions. Like saloons? The doctor asked, gesturing toward the room around them. Exactly like saloons, the judge replied. This place serves functions that churches, courthouses, and hospitals are supposed to serve. But it serves them better because it's designed around the way people actually live out here, not the way they're supposed to live according to some Eastern textbook. This conversation fascinated you because it revealed how the frontier wasn't just a place where Eastern civilization was transplanted. It was a place where entirely new forms of social organization were being invented. The saloon wasn't a crude substitute for more refined institutions. It was a sophisticated response to conditions that made Eastern institutions impractical or irrelevant. But as you listened, you noticed something else. Each of these conversations was being conducted with one eye on the room's other occupants, and specifically on a man sitting alone at a corner table, nursing a single glass of beer and apparently absorbed in a week-old newspaper. The man was unremarkable in most respects. Medium height, brown hair going gray at the temples, clothes that marked him as neither rich nor poor, just another traveler passing through. But there was something about the way he held himself, the way his eyes moved constantly, despite his apparent concentration on his reading, that suggested depths beneath the ordinary surface. This, you realized, must be the mysterious stranger Maggie had been discussing with Marshall Williams on the porch. And now that you knew to look for it, you could see the subtle signs of wariness throughout the room. Conversations were slightly more guarded than usual. People were sitting with their backs to walls. The usual easy laughter was muted. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, but nobody knew what, when, or how. Into this atmosphere of barely perceptible tension stepped a figure who changed everything simply by walking through the door. She was perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair swept back in a practical style and intelligent brown eyes that took in the entire room in a single glance. Her dress was well made but designed for travel, and she carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. But what really set her apart was the way every conversation in the room paused momentarily as she entered, then resumed at a slightly lower volume. This was clearly someone who commanded respect, but you couldn't immediately tell why. She wasn't dressed like wealth, didn't carry herself like authority, and showed no signs of the kind of beauty that stopped men in their tracks. Yet something about her presence suggested that her arrival was significant. Maggie appeared at the woman's side almost immediately, and their greeting was warm but brief. A few quiet words were exchanged. Then the newcomer made her way to the bar, where Tom Phillips already had a glass of wine waiting. "Evening, Miss Catherine," Tom said, and his tone held the kind of respect usually reserved for family members. "Evening, Tom. Sarah. Jimmy." She nodded to each of the staff members, then turned to survey the room. Her gaze lingered for just a moment on the mysterious stranger in the corner. "And you caught a flicker of something? Recognition? Concern?" Before she returned her attention to her wine. Colonel Morrison approached her immediately, removing his hat with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that suggested both good breeding and genuine respect. "Miss Catherine, I hope you don't mind my asking, but is there any word about the railroad situation? Some of my men have been talking about heading up to the railhead for work, and I'd hate for them to walk into trouble." So she was connected to the railroad somehow. That would explain the respect. Railroads were the lifeline that connected frontier communities to the larger world, and anyone with inside knowledge about railroad affairs wielded considerable influence. "The strike's been settled, Colonel, but it's going to be another month before they resume full operations. If your men can wait that long, there'll be plenty of work. If they can't wait, there are opportunities with the Southern Pacific Line, but that means going to California." She spoke with the authority of someone who had access to information others couldn't obtain, and her assessment was clearly valued by everyone who heard it. But you noticed that she continued to glance toward the corner table where the mysterious stranger sat, and her expression grew more troubled with each look. Finally, she made a decision. Setting down her wine glass, she walked directly to the stranger's table and sat down without waiting for an invitation. The room's conversations continued, but you could sense everyone straining to overhear what was being said. Unfortunately, the acoustic design that usually made private conversations possible now worked against your curiosity. You could see their lips moving, could observe their body language growing more intense, but you couldn't make out individual words. What you could see was this: the woman, Miss Catherine, was clearly familiar with the stranger, and their relationship was complicated. There was anger in her posture, but also concern, fear, but also determination. The stranger, for his part, seemed to be explaining or justifying something, and his explanations weren't being well received. Their conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt much longer. Finally, Miss Catherine stood up, and her voice rose just enough to be audible. "I can't protect you if you won't be honest with me, David. And I can't let you put these people at risk just because you're too proud to ask for help." She returned to the bar, retrieved her wine, and walked quickly toward the staircase that led to the upper rooms. The stranger, David, apparently, remained seated for several minutes, staring at his beer glass as if it contained answers to questions he hadn't figured out how to ask. Then he too stood, left money on the table, and walked out into the night. The room was quiet for a long moment after his departure. Then, gradually, conversations resumed, but with an undercurrent of unease that hadn't been there before. Everyone understood that they'd witnessed the prelude to something important, but nobody knew what role they might be called upon to play in whatever came next. Maggie emerged from behind the bar and began moving from table to table, checking on customers with the practiced ease of someone who understood that successful hospitality required constant attention to detail. But when she reached your table, instead of the usual pleasantries, she sat down and fixed you with a direct stare. You're new here, so you might not understand what just happened," she said quietly. "That woman is Catherine Morrison, the colonel's daughter, but more importantly, she's the person who coordinates railroad security for this entire territory. Smart as a whip, tougher than most men, and one of the few people in Texas who can't be bought, threatened, or fooled." She paused, glancing toward the door through which the stranger had departed. The man she was talking to used to work for the railroad, too. Used to be her partner, actually, in more ways than one. But something happened 6 months ago, something that got him dismissed from railroad service and put a price on his head. What kind of something, you ask, drawn into the drama despite yourself? The kind that involves missing payroll money, dead guards, and wanted posters with his face on them. The kind that turns a man from a hero into a hunted criminal overnight, whether he deserves it or not. Maggie's voice dropped even lower, and you had to lean forward to hear her clearly. Now, I've been in this business long enough to know the difference between a man who's guilty and a man who's been framed. David Kellerman is a lot of things: proud, stubborn, too quick to trust the wrong people. But he's not a killer, and he's not a thief. Problem is, the evidence against him is solid enough that it doesn't matter what I think, or what Catherine thinks, or what anyone who knows him thinks. She stood up, smoothing her skirts with the automatic gesture of someone whose mind was working on problems far more complex than wrinkled fabric. What matters is that someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure David would take the blame for that robbery. And if they went to that much trouble, it means they're not finished with whatever they started. Which means this community, my community, is about to become a battleground in someone else's war. With that sobering observation, she moved on to the next table, leaving you to contemplate the implications of what you just learned. A framed man, a woman torn between loyalty and duty, missing money, and dead guards. All the ingredients for the kind of violence that could shatter the careful balance of civility that made places like the Lone Star possible. But as the evening wore on, you began to understand that the real story was more complex than a simple tale of guilt and innocence, law and lawlessness. Because everyone in the room, the colonel, the judge, Dr. Mitchell, Father Rodriguez, even young Billy, the cowhand, had some connection to David Kellerman, some reason to care about his fate beyond abstract justice. The railroad wasn't just a business to these people. It was their lifeline to the outside world, their connection to markets where they could sell their cattle, their source of supplies and manufactured goods, their means of communication with distant family members. David Kellerman hadn't just been a railroad security officer. He'd been the man who ensured that their lifeline remained secure. And Catherine Morrison wasn't just concerned about an old colleague or former lover. She was trying to protect the entire network of relationships and dependencies that kept frontier communities from sliding back into isolation and subsistence. This was why the Frontier Saloon was such a crucial institution. It wasn't just a place where people gathered to drink and socialize. It was where information was exchanged, where alliances were formed, where communities decided how to respond to threats and opportunities. It was where democracy happened, not through formal votes, but through the kind of consensus building that emerged from honest conversation between people who had to live with the consequences of their decisions. But it was also where those same communities were most vulnerable to disruption, because if the social fabric that held everything together was torn by violence, by betrayal, by the kind of outside pressure that turned neighbors into enemies, then the institutions that depended on that fabric would collapse as well. As if to underscore this point, the swinging doors suddenly burst open with a violence that silenced every conversation in the room. 3 men entered, and everything about them screamed trouble. They weren't dressed like locals. Their clothes were too new, their boots too clean, their weapons too prominently displayed. But more than that, they moved with the kind of aggressive confidence that suggested they weren't planning to follow the social rules that made peaceful coexistence possible. The leader was a big man with pale eyes and a carefully groomed mustache. His companions flanked him automatically, their hands resting casually on their gun butts as they surveyed the room with obvious disdain. "Good evening, folks," the leader said, and his voice carried the kind of false friendliness that made everyone nervous. "Name's Porter, and these are my associates, Mr. Jenkins and Mr. Crawford. We're looking for a man named David Kellerman, and we have reason to believe he might have passed through your fine establishment this evening." The room remained silent, not the comfortable quiet of people listening to music or absorbed in private conversations, but the tense silence of people trying to become invisible. Porter's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Now, I know he was here because we tracked him from the hotel. And I know someone in this room talked to him because that's what people do in places like this. They talk. So let's make this easy. Tell me what you know about Kellerman, and nobody has to get hurt." It was Maggie who broke the silence, stepping forward with the kind of calm authority that had kept her establishment peaceful for 8 years. "Mr. Porter, is it? I'm Maggie O'Sullivan, and this is my place. If you're looking for someone, you're welcome to look around, but you'll need to check your weapons at the bar first. House rules." Porter's laugh was genuinely amused. "Lady, I don't think you understand the situation here. We're not customers looking for a drink and a meal. We're bounty hunters looking for a wanted criminal, and we don't follow house rules." "Then you're not welcome in my house," Maggie replied, her voice still calm, but with an edge that suggested steel beneath the civility. "And I'll thank you to leave before you disturb my paying customers any further." The confrontation might have escalated immediately, but Colonel Morrison chose that moment to stand up from his place at the bar. He didn't say anything, didn't make any threatening gestures, just stood up and turned to face the 3 strangers. Then Miguel Santos stood up, then Billy Thompson, then Judge Reed, Dr. Mitchell, Father Rodriguez, and every other man in the room. It wasn't organized or planned, just the natural response of people who understood that their community was being threatened by outsiders who didn't respect the rules that made civilization possible. Porter looked around the room, his expression shifting from arrogant confidence to wary calculation. 3 against 1 were odds any gunman would take. 3 against 20 were odds only a fool would accept. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Kellerman's wanted for murder and robbery, and there's a $1,000 reward for his capture. Anyone who helps him is making themselves accessories to his crimes." He turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at Maggie. "You might want to think about that, Mrs. O'Sullivan. $1,000 is a lot of money, enough to buy a lot of silence or a lot of cooperation." After the 3 men left, the room remained tense for several minutes. People slowly returned to their seats and their conversations, but the easy camaraderie of earlier in the evening had been replaced by something harder and more purposeful. Colonel Morrison approached Maggie, his usual courtly manner replaced by the direct manner of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions. "Maggie, those men aren't going to give up. They know Kellerman was here, and they know someone in this room has information they want. They'll be back, probably with more men, and they won't be polite about asking questions." Maggie nodded grimly. "I know, Colonel. Question is, what are we going to do about it?" "That depends," Judge Reed interjected, joining the conversation. "Do we know whether Kellerman is actually guilty of what they're accusing him of?" All eyes turned to the staircase as Catherine Morrison descended from the upper floor, Her earlier anger had been replaced by a kind of determined resolve that suggested she'd made some difficult decisions during her brief absence. David Kellerman didn't rob that train, she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. He was framed by someone who needed a scapegoat for their own crimes. And if we let those bounty hunters take him, an innocent man will hang while the real criminals go free. How can you be so sure? Dr. Mitchell asked. Catherine's smile was bitter. Because I was supposed to be on that train. David and I were both assigned to guard the payroll shipment. But at the last minute, I was reassigned to investigate some trouble further up the line. Trouble that turned out to be completely fabricated. Someone wanted me away from that train, and they wanted David isolated and vulnerable. She moved to the center of the room, addressing everyone present as if they were a jury deliberating a verdict. The official story is that David killed 2 guards and stole $50,000 in railroad payroll money. But I know David, and I know how railroad security works. David Kellerman couldn't have opened that strongbox without help from someone with inside knowledge of the security procedures. And he wouldn't have killed anyone, even if his life depended on it. But if he's innocent, Billy Thompson asked, why is he running? Why doesn't he just turn himself in and prove his innocence in court? Catherine's expression darkened. Because the people who framed him have connections all the way to the territorial capital. They've made sure the evidence points to David, and they've made sure that anyone who might testify in his favor either disappears or changes their story. David's only chance is to find proof of his innocence before they catch up to him. Judge Reed stroked his beard thoughtfully. And what kind of proof would that be? The real payroll money. It's still out there somewhere, probably being laundered through legitimate businesses or converted into untraceable gold. Find the money, and you find the real thieves. Colonel Morrison leaned forward. Do you have any idea who might be behind this? Catherine hesitated, then made another decision. I have suspicions, but suspicions aren't proof, and accusations without proof are dangerous to everyone involved. The room fell quiet as people absorbed the implications of what they'd learned. An innocent man was being hunted by bounty hunters who didn't care about guilt or innocence, only about collecting their reward. A real criminal was still free, probably planning additional crimes. And a community that prided itself on fairness and justice was being asked to choose between legal authority and moral conscience. It was Father Rodriguez who broke the silence. In my country, we have a saying, La justicia delayed is justice denied. But we also say, La verdad has a way of surfacing, like oil on water. Sometimes the law and justice are the same thing. Sometimes they are not. Judge Reed nodded slowly. I've spent 30 years believing that the law is the foundation of civilization. But I've also seen enough frontier justice to know that sometimes the law fails people who deserve better. So, what are you saying? Dr. Mitchell asked. I'm saying, the judge replied carefully, that this community has the right to make its own decisions about how to handle threats to its welfare. And I'm saying that if we believe an innocent man is being persecuted, we have a moral obligation to help him, regardless of what any official authority might prefer. It was a remarkable statement from a man whose entire career was built on respect for legal authority. But it was also entirely consistent with the democratic principles that governed life in places like the Lone Star. When formal institutions failed to serve justice, informal institutions had to fill the gap. Maggie looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present. I want everyone to understand what we're talking about here. If we decide to help David Kellerman, we're setting ourselves against territorial law enforcement, against the railroad security apparatus, and against bounty hunters who make their living through violence. This isn't a decision we can take lightly. Colonel Morrison stood up again. Maggie's right. This is serious business, but I'll tell you what I think. David Kellerman spent 2 years making sure our cattle shipments reached market safely. He made sure the monthly payroll arrived on time so we could pay our men. He made sure the supplies we ordered actually got delivered instead of disappearing somewhere along the line. As far as I'm concerned, we owe him better than to stand aside while he gets railroaded by people who don't care about the truth. One by one, others voiced their agreement. Miguel Santos talked about David helping to locate his missing cattle after rustlers had scattered his small herd. Dr. Mitchell remembered David arranging for emergency medical supplies during a cholera outbreak. Even young Billy Thompson had a story about David intervening when some railroad workers had tried to cheat him out of his wages. It became clear that David Kellerman wasn't just a casual acquaintance to these people. He was part of their community, someone who'd earned their loyalty through consistent, decent behavior over an extended period. The kind of man who deserved the benefit of the doubt, especially when the doubt was reasonable. But it also became clear that helping him wouldn't be simple or safe. The bounty hunters would return, probably with reinforcements. The territorial authorities would eventually get involved. And if David was recaptured, everyone who'd helped him could face serious legal consequences. As the discussion continued, you found yourself thinking about the larger implications of what you were witnessing. This wasn't just a group of people deciding whether to help a friend in trouble. This was a community defining itself, choosing what values it would uphold and what principles it would defend, even at significant personal cost. The Frontier Saloon, you realized, wasn't just where democracy happened. It was where democracy was tested, where high-minded ideals confronted practical realities, where individual conscience wrestled with collective responsibility, where the abstract concept of justice became a concrete decision that real people had to make and live with. And as the evening wore on, as plans were made and responsibilities divided, as people committed themselves to a course of action that could cost them everything they'd worked to build, you understood that you were witnessing one of those moments when history pivots on the decisions of ordinary people in unremarkable places. The Lone Star Saloon was about to become something more than a gathering place for a frontier community. It was about to become the headquarters of a resistance movement, the nerve center of an investigation, and possibly the final refuge of people who'd chosen conscience over safety. But first, they had to figure out where David Kellerman had gone and how to find him before the bounty hunters did. Chapter 4. Where Stories Become. Truth and truth becomes legend. The clock above the bar, one of the few timepieces in Millerville that actually kept reliable time, showed nearly midnight when Maggie finally turned the key in the front door and drew the curtains across the windows. But instead of the usual end-of-evening cleanup, the Lone Star was preparing for an entirely different kind of late-night activity. What remained was the core group: Maggie and her staff, Colonel Morrison, Judge Reed, Dr. Mitchell, Catherine Morrison, and a handful of others whose commitment to David Kellerman's cause had been tested and proven over the course of the evening's discussions. The casual customers had drifted away as the conversations grew more serious and the implications more dangerous. But those who remained understood that they were no longer just patrons of a saloon. They were conspirators in a cause that could either save an innocent man or destroy them all. Catherine had retrieved a leather satchel from her room upstairs, and now she spread its contents across one of the larger tables. Maps of the railroad line, official correspondence, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be coded telegrams. The detritus of a professional investigation that had been proceeding quietly for months while David Kellerman fled from one hiding place to another. "The robbery happened here," she began, pointing to a spot on the map about 50 miles north of Millerville. "Mill Creek Junction, where the line crosses the river. It's a natural place for a holdup. The train has to slow down for the bridge, and there are plenty of places for men to hide in the rocks along the riverbank." Judge Reed studied the map with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating evidence. But that would make it a particularly difficult robbery to execute without inside information. The train schedule, the security procedures, the amount of money being carried. All of that information is closely guarded. "Exactly," Catherine agreed, which is why the official investigation focused on David from the beginning. As the senior security officer on that run, he had access to all the information the robbers would have needed. The fact that he survived when 2 other guards were killed just made him look more suspicious. Colonel Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. "But you said you were supposed to be on that train originally. What happened to change your assignment?" Catherine's jaw tightened. 3 days before the scheduled run, I received orders to investigate reports of track sabotage further up the line. The orders came from regional headquarters, signed by Assistant Director Hamilton and marked as urgent priority. I didn't question them. Hamilton was my immediate superior, and track sabotage was exactly the kind of threat we were supposed to take seriously. "But the reports were false?" Dr. Mitchell asked. "Completely fabricated. I spent 2 days investigating damage that didn't exist, interviewing railroad workers who had no knowledge of any problems. By the time I realized I'd been sent on a wild goose chase, the robbery had already happened and David was on the run." Maggie, who had been listening while continuing to wipe down glasses with automatic efficiency, paused in her work. "What about this Assistant Director Hamilton? Where does he fit into all this?" Catherine's expression grew even grimmer. "That's where the story gets complicated. Hamilton has been with the railroad for 15 years, worked his way up from track inspector to his current position, and has a spotless reputation for integrity and competence. There's no obvious reason why he would be involved in robbing his own trains. Unless," Judge Reed suggested, "he wasn't involved voluntarily." All eyes turned to the judge, who was studying one of the newspaper clippings with particular interest. "This article about the robbery mentions that Hamilton was recently promoted to his current position after his predecessor died in an accident." "What kind of accident?" Catherine shuffled through her papers until she found the relevant document. "Charles Brennan, the previous assistant director, was killed in a fall from his horse while inspecting remote track sections. It was ruled accidental, but—" She paused, her expression troubled. "But," Colonel Morrison prompted, "but David always said Brennan was one of the best horsemen he'd ever known. It seemed unlikely that he would die in such a mundane accident." The implications hung in the air like smoke from the oil lamps. If Brennan's death hadn't been accidental, if Hamilton had been installed in his position specifically to facilitate the robbery, then the conspiracy was far more complex and dangerous than anyone had realized. Tom Phillips, who had been quietly cleaning glasses behind the bar, suddenly spoke up. "Begging your pardon, Miss Catherine, but there's something you might want to know. That man Porter, the bounty hunter, he was asking about more than just David Kellerman. He was asking about railroad schedules, about who in town had connections to railroad business, about whether any strangers had been through asking questions about freight shipments." Catherine looked up sharply, What kind of questions about freight shipments? The kind that suggested he might be looking for something specific. Something that might have been shipped through here recently or might be expected to arrive soon. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. The bounty hunters weren't just hunting David Kellerman. They were conducting some kind of intelligence operation, gathering information that could only be useful if they were planning additional crimes. Carlos Reyes, who had been so quiet you'd almost forgotten he was in the room, suddenly stood up from his position near the door. In the Apache tradition he'd learned as a child, he'd been listening not just to the conversations inside the building, but to the sounds from outside as well. "Riders approaching," he said simply. 3 horses, maybe 4, coming from the south at a steady pace. They'll be here in about 5 minutes. Everyone froze. The bounty hunters returning with reinforcements? A military patrol? Or simply late-arriving travelers looking for a meal and a bed? Maggie made the decision with the quick efficiency that had kept her establishment running smoothly for 8 years. "Carlos, get to the back door and keep watch. Tom, bank the fire and dim the lamps. If they're looking for us, let's not make it easy. Everyone else, act natural, but be ready to move fast if necessary." The transformation of the Lone Star from conspiracy headquarters to innocent saloon was accomplished in less than 2 minutes. The maps and documents disappeared into Catherine's satchel. The chairs were rearranged to suggest casual conversation rather than organized planning, and everyone settled into positions that looked relaxed but provided quick access to exits and weapons. The riders, when they arrived, proved to be something none of them had expected. David Kellerman himself, accompanied by 3 men who were obviously not bounty hunters or law enforcement officers, but weren't easily categorizable either. David looked older than when he'd left the saloon hours earlier, as if the evening's events had aged him years rather than hours. His companions were clearly frontier men. Their clothes, weapons, and horses marked them as people who lived hard lives in difficult places. But they moved with a kind of disciplined precision that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. When the 4 men entered the saloon, David immediately raised his hands in a gesture of peace and explanation. "Before anyone says anything," he began, "I want you to know that I didn't come back to put anyone in danger. But I also couldn't leave knowing that Porter and his men were threatening people who've shown me nothing but kindness." He gestured toward his companions. "This is John Wesley Parker, formerly of the Texas Rangers. Frank Morrison, no relation to the colonel, formerly a detective with the Pinkerton Agency. And Sam Rodriguez, who, until recently, was a federal marshal in New Mexico Territory." The 3 men nodded politely but remained alert, their eyes constantly scanning the room for potential threats. These were clearly professionals, men who knew how to handle dangerous situations. Catherine stood up, her expression a complex mixture of relief, anger, and concern. "David, what are you doing? Every law enforcement agency in 3 states is looking for you, and you're traveling with..." "Who exactly are these men?" It was John Wesley Parker who answered. "Ma'am, we're what you might call freelance investigators, men who've worked within the system long enough to know how it fails and who've decided to pursue justice through less official channels." Judge Reed leaned forward with obvious interest. "Are you saying you believe in David's innocence?" Frank Morrison, the former Pinkerton detective, produced a folder thick with documents and photographs. "Judge, we're not just saying we believe in his innocence. We're saying we can prove it. But first, we need to make sure everyone in this room understands what we're really dealing with here." He spread several photographs across the table, images that made everyone lean forward for a closer look. These were taken at the site of the Mill Creek robbery, but they were never entered into evidence at the official investigation. They show details that contradict the official version of events. The photographs revealed evidence that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored. Hoof prints that suggested more riders than had been officially reported, positioning of the bodies that was inconsistent with the supposed sequence of events, and physical evidence of an explosion that wasn't mentioned in any official reports. Sam Rodriguez, the former federal marshal, added his own disturbing information. We've also discovered that the Mill Creek robbery wasn't an isolated incident. Over the past 18 months, there have been at least 6 similar robberies along various railroad lines throughout the territory. Same methods, same inside knowledge, same pattern of framing a security officer who happened to be conveniently isolated when the robbery occurred. Dr. Mitchell studied the photographs with the clinical attention he usually reserved for medical diagnoses. This suggests a systematic operation, not random criminal activity. Exactly, David said, speaking for the first time since making introductions. We believe there's an organized conspiracy to rob railroad payroll shipments, using inside information to plan the robberies and then framing security personnel to misdirect official investigations. Colonel Morrison stroked his beard thoughtfully. But who would have the resources and connections to organize something like that? It was Catherine who answered, her voice heavy with implications she clearly wished she didn't have to share. Someone with access to railroad personnel records, someone who could arrange transfers and assignments, someone who could manipulate official investigations, someone very high up in the railroad hierarchy. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the full scope of what was being suggested. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or overzealous law enforcement. This was evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the Territorial Railroad Administration, a conspiracy that had already resulted in multiple murders and would certainly result in more if it wasn't stopped. John Wesley Parker spread out additional documents, financial records, shipping manifests, personnel files that had been obtained through methods he didn't specify, but were clearly not entirely legal. The pattern becomes clear when you look at the broader picture, he explained. Each robbery coincided with particularly large payroll shipments. Each targeted security officer had recently been transferred to a new position, and each official investigation was conducted by the same team of territorial marshals. Frank Morrison added his own analysis. We believe the conspiracy involves at least 3 levels. Railroad officials who provide inside information, the actual robbery crews who carry out the crimes, and territorial law enforcement officers who ensure the investigations focus on convenient scapegoats rather than actual perpetrators. The implications were staggering. If these men were correct, then David Kellerman wasn't just an innocent man being pursued by misguided authorities. He was a witness whose testimony could bring down a criminal enterprise that had infiltrated some of the most powerful institutions in the territory. But if they were correct, it also meant that everyone in the Lone Star Saloon was now in mortal danger, because conspirators capable of organizing multiple murders and manipulating official investigations wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations. Maggie, ever practical, asked the question everyone was thinking. What do you want from us? And what can we realistically do to help that won't get us all killed? Sam Rodriguez answered with the directness of someone accustomed to dealing with life and death situations. We need a place to work where we won't be disturbed or discovered. We need access to local communications, telegraph, mail, messengers, and we need people who can move around the community gathering information without attracting suspicion. Most importantly, David added, we need time. The conspiracy we're investigating has been operating for 18 months. We've been investigating it for 6 months. We're close to having enough evidence to expose the whole operation, but we need another few weeks to tie together all the loose ends. Judge Reed asked the crucial question. And What happens to David in the meantime? Those bounty hunters aren't going to give up, and eventually they'll bring in enough reinforcements to search every building in town. It was Carlos Reyes who provided the answer, speaking with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the territory better than anyone else in the room. There are places in the desert where a man can hide for months without being found, if he knows how to live off the land and move without leaving tracks. I can keep David safe, while his friends do their investigating. But first, we need to make sure those bounty hunters don't come back with an army. Colonel Morrison stood up, his decision made. Then, I guess it's time for this community to show what we're made of. We've built something good here, something worth defending, and we're not going to let outside criminals destroy it, whether they're wearing badges or not. One by one, others voiced their agreement, not because they were looking for adventure or excitement, but because they understood that sometimes ordinary people have to take extraordinary risks to protect the things that matter most. The Lone Star Saloon, which had begun the evening as a peaceful gathering place for friends and neighbors, was now the headquarters of what might generously be called a resistance movement, or what less generous observers might call a conspiracy to obstruct justice. But as the night wore on, as plans were made and responsibilities assigned, as people committed themselves to a course of action that could cost them their livelihoods, their freedom, or their lives, it became clear that something else was happening as well. The community that had grown up around the Lone Star wasn't just defending one innocent man against false accusations. They were defending the principle that justice mattered more than authority, that truth mattered more than convenience, and that ordinary people had the right and responsibility to resist when official institutions failed to serve the common good. They were, in other words, creating the kind of democracy that the frontier required. Not the formal democracy of elections and legislatures, but the essential democracy of people who chose to stand together against threats to everything they'd worked to build. But they were also walking into dangers they couldn't fully anticipate, challenging adversaries whose resources and ruthlessness they could only guess at, and committing themselves to a fight that would test everything they believed about courage, loyalty, and the price of doing the right thing. As dawn approached and the meeting finally broke up, as people slipped away to their homes and hiding places, as the Lone Star returned to the quiet that precedes the start of another day, you found yourself thinking about the stories that would grow from this night's events. Because that's what frontier saloons were really about, in the end. Not just the places where stories were told, but the places where stories were made, where ordinary people faced extraordinary choices and discovered what they were really made of, where legends began not with dramatic gestures or heroic speeches, but with quiet decisions made by tired people who understood that someone had to take a stand, even when, especially when, the cost of standing might be everything they had. The sun was rising over Millerville, Texas, painting the dusty streets and wooden buildings in the warm gold of early morning light. But beneath the peaceful surface of this ordinary frontier town, forces were stirring that would soon transform it into something far more significant. A battleground where the future of justice in the American West would be decided by people who never asked for the responsibility, but accepted it anyway. And at the center of it all stood the Lone Star Saloon, its doors closed now, but its purpose just beginning to unfold. Chapter 5. The Taste of Freedom and the Price of Truth. Morning came early to the Lone Star, as it always did. By 6 o'clock, Sarah Martinez was already in the kitchen, building up the fire in the great stove and beginning preparations for the breakfast that would soon fill the saloon with the familiar aromas of coffee, bacon, and fresh biscuits. But this morning was different from all the others that had come before. This morning, Sarah worked with the heightened awareness of someone who knew that danger could arrive at any moment, that every customer who walked through those swinging doors might be friend, enemy, or something more complicated than either. This morning, the simple act of brewing coffee and frying eggs had become part of a larger strategy to maintain the appearance of normalcy while concealing activities that could get everyone involved hanged as conspirators. By 7 o'clock, the first customers were arriving. Local workers stopping by for a quick breakfast before heading to their jobs. Travelers from the hotel seeking a substantial meal before continuing their journeys. And the usual collection of early risers who found the Lone Star's atmosphere more congenial than their own solitary quarters. To any casual observer, it was a perfectly ordinary morning in a perfectly ordinary frontier establishment. The conversations centered on weather, livestock prices, and local gossip. The staff moved through their routines with practiced efficiency. The coffee was strong, the food was satisfying, and the atmosphere was welcoming in exactly the ways that had made the Lone Star successful. But beneath the surface, normalcy, a complex operation was taking shape. Carlos Reyes had departed before dawn with David Kellerman and the 3 investigators, leading them to hiding places in the desert that had sheltered Apache war parties for generations and would now conceal men whose only crime was seeking justice in a system that had forgotten what justice meant. Their departure had been timed to coincide with the change of guard at the livery stable, when the night watchman's departure and the day manager's arrival created a brief window of opportunity for unobserved movement. Colonel Morrison had returned to his ranch, but not to resume normal operations. Instead, he was organizing what he called expanded security patrols, groups of armed riders who would monitor the approaches to Millerville and provide early warning of any large groups approaching the town. To outside observers, these patrols would appear to be routine measures to protect against cattle rustlers or Apache raiders. In reality, they were the eyes and ears of a defensive network designed to prevent the bounty hunters from returning with reinforcements. Judge Reed had composed carefully worded telegrams to colleagues in Austin and San Antonio, messages that appeared to be routine requests for legal clarification, but were actually inquiries about the background and authority of the bounty hunters who had threatened the town. The judge's reputation for scholarly precision in legal matters meant that his research questions would be answered thoroughly and without suspicion. Dr. Mitchell had begun reviewing his medical supplies and preparing to treat what he euphemistically called various emergency conditions. In plain language, he was getting ready to deal with gunshot wounds because everyone understood that the situation was likely to escalate beyond the point where peaceful resolution remained possible. Even Father Rodriguez had found a role in the developing conspiracy, announcing that he would be conducting a special series of evening services focused on moral guidance in times of trial. These services would provide cover for gatherings where information could be shared and plans could be coordinated without attracting attention from hostile observers. But it was Maggie herself who carried the heaviest burden, because maintaining the Lone Star's normal operations while serving as the communication center for an underground investigation required skills that no frontier education had prepared her for. She had to greet regular customers with genuine warmth while remaining alert for signs that any of them might be informants or infiltrators. She had to conduct routine business, ordering supplies, managing staff schedules, handling financial transactions, while also coordinating the flow of information between widely scattered participants in a dangerous enterprise. She had to project confidence and stability while privately understanding that everything she'd worked to build could be destroyed if even one element of their complex plan went wrong. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the fact that it had to be done in full view of anyone who chose to observe. The Lone Star's success had always depended on transparency. Customers could see into the kitchen, could observe the staff's interactions with each other, could overhear most conversations and form their own judgments about the establishment's character and integrity. This openness, which had been one of the saloon's greatest assets, was now also its greatest vulnerability. Around 10 o'clock, the first test of their carefully constructed facade arrived in the form of a well-dressed man who claimed to represent a livestock buyers association based in Kansas City. He asked intelligent questions about local cattle operations, paid for his meal with genuine currency, and displayed exactly the kind of interest in the community's economic prospects that any legitimate business representative might show. But Tom Phillips noticed that the man's hands showed no signs of the kind of work that livestock dealers typically performed. Sarah Martinez observed that he ate with the careful precision of someone who was paying more attention to the conversations around him than to the food on his plate. And Maggie realized that his questions, while superficially innocent, were designed to elicit information about shipping schedules, security arrangements, and the movement of large sums of money through the local banking system. The stranger left after finishing his meal, apparently satisfied with the information he'd gathered. But his visit served as a reminder that the conspiracy they were fighting had resources that extended far beyond simple bounty hunters and crooked territorial officials. They were dealing with people sophisticated enough to send advanced scouts who could gather intelligence while appearing to conduct legitimate business. The morning passed without further incident, but the tension continued to build throughout the day. Regular customers seemed to sense that something was different about the Lone Star's atmosphere, though they couldn't identify exactly what had changed. Conversations were slightly more guarded than usual. Staff members moved with a heightened alertness that suggested they were expecting trouble. Even the piano music, when Jimmy Kelligan began his afternoon session, seemed more subdued than normal. It was during the quiet period between the noon meal and the evening rush that Catherine Morrison made her next appearance, arriving not through the front door, but through the kitchen entrance that connected to the alley behind the building. Her method of arrival was itself a message. She was no longer moving openly through the community, which meant she believed she was being watched by hostile forces. The information she brought was both encouraging and alarming. The encouraging news was that her telegraphed inquiries to railroad headquarters had yielded confirmation of their suspicions. Assistant Director Hamilton had indeed been making unusual personnel assignments over the past year, consistently placing security officers in positions where they would be isolated and vulnerable during high-value shipments. Moreover, financial records showed that Hamilton had been living far beyond his official salary, though his additional income was being laundered through a series of apparently legitimate investments. The alarming news was that Catherine's inquiries had apparently triggered a response from the very people they were investigating. Within hours of her sending those telegrams, new orders had arrived reassigning her to a position in the territorial capital, orders that would effectively remove her from any involvement in the Kellerman investigation and place her under the direct supervision of officials who might be part of the conspiracy. "They're trying to isolate me the same way they isolated David," she explained to the small group gathered in the Lone Star's back room, "which means they know I'm getting close to something they don't want exposed." Maggie set a cup of coffee in front of Catherine and asked the obvious question. "What happens if you refuse the reassignment?" "Then I'll be charged with insubordination and dismissed from railroad service. Either way, I lose my official authority to investigate this case." Judge Reed, who had been studying the official documents Catherine had received, looked up with a troubled expression. "These orders are signed by Regional Director Morrison, no relation to our colonel, I presume, and countersigned by Territorial Administrator Phillips. If this conspiracy reaches that high in the territorial government, then we're dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple criminal enterprise." The implications were sobering. If territorial officials were involved in the conspiracy, then appealing to higher authorities might be not just useless, but actively dangerous. The evidence they were gathering might never reach honest investigators, and the people gathering it might find themselves facing fabricated charges of their own. Tom Phillips, who had been listening from his position behind the bar, suddenly held up a hand for silence. "Someone's coming," he said quietly. Multiple riders, approaching fast. Through the front windows they could see a dust cloud rising from the direction of the main road, the kind of dust cloud raised by horses being ridden hard across dry ground. Within minutes, the sound of hoofbeats confirmed what everyone had feared. The bounty hunters were returning, and this time they had brought reinforcements. The group scattered quickly, Catherine disappearing back through the kitchen entrance while the others took positions that would appear casual to outside observers, but provided good fields of view for monitoring the approaching threat. When the riders finally arrived, they proved to be both more and less than expected. Porter was indeed back, but instead of the small army of gunmen many had feared, he was accompanied by only 2 additional men. However, these weren't rough frontier bounty hunters, but rather official-looking individuals whose appearance suggested federal authority. The leader of the new arrivals was a tall, thin man with the kind of pale complexion that marked him as someone who spent most of his time in offices rather than outdoors. His companion was younger, but carried himself with the rigid bearing of military service. Both wore badges that, even at a distance, clearly marked them as federal marshals. Porter's greeting to Maggie was superficially polite, but carried an undercurrent of threat that hadn't been present during his earlier visit. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'd like you to meet Marshal Henderson and Deputy Marshal Crawford from the Territorial Capital. They're here to investigate reports of criminal conspiracy in this area." Marshal Henderson stepped forward, producing an official document with impressive seals and signatures. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, we have reason to believe that known fugitive David Kellerman has received assistance from individuals in this community. Harboring a federal fugitive is a serious crime, punishable by substantial fines and imprisonment. We're prepared to offer amnesty to anyone who cooperates voluntarily with our investigation, but that offer won't remain open indefinitely." The marshal's tone was measured and professional, but his message was clear. He was offering people a chance to betray David Kellerman and his supporters in exchange for avoiding prosecution themselves. It was a classic law enforcement technique, designed to break up conspiracies by turning participants against each other. Maggie's response was a masterpiece of apparent cooperation combined with actual resistance. "Marshal Henderson, I want to assure you that everyone at the Lone Star respects federal authority and wants to see justice done. If David Kellerman is guilty of the crimes he's accused of, then he should face trial and punishment. But if he's innocent, then he deserves the same protection under law that any citizen should expect." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "Now, you say you have reason to believe he's received assistance from people in this community. I'd be very interested to know what that reason might be, because I can tell you with absolute certainty that no one at the Lone Star has done anything to obstruct legitimate law enforcement activities." It was a carefully constructed response that sounded cooperative while actually challenging the marshals to provide evidence for their accusations. More importantly, it established Maggie as someone who was willing to engage with federal authority rather than simply defying it, which would make it much harder for them to justify aggressive action against her or her establishment. Marshal Henderson studied Maggie for a long moment, clearly reassessing his initial assumptions about what kind of person he was dealing with. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, David Kellerman was seen leaving this establishment last night at approximately 10 o'clock. He was then observed meeting with several other individuals before departing the area entirely. We know this because we have reliable witnesses to these events." The marshal's confidence suggested that he indeed had sources of information within the community, either paid informants or people who had been coerced into cooperation through threats or promises. Judge Reed, who had been quietly observing the exchange, chose this moment to exercise his own authority. "Marshal Henderson, I'm Judge Harrison Reed, and I'm responsible for legal proceedings in this jurisdiction. Before this investigation proceeds any further, I'd like to review the warrants and jurisdictional documents that authorize your activities here." The judge's intervention served multiple purposes. It established that federal authorities couldn't simply ignore local legal procedures. It bought time for other participants in the conspiracy to adjust their plans, and it signaled to the community that they had official support from at least one legitimate source of legal authority. Marshal Henderson produced additional documents, which Judge Reed examined with the careful attention that frontier communities expected from their legal officers. The documents appeared to be in proper order: warrants for David Kellerman's arrest, authorization for federal investigation of suspected conspiracies, and orders granting the marshals broad discretionary powers in conducting their investigation. But as Judge Reed studied the paperwork, he noticed something that others might have missed. The signatures and seals were all genuine, but they authorized investigation of suspected conspiracy to obstruct justice in the matter of the Mill Creek Railroad robbery. There was no authorization for investigating the original robbery itself, which suggested that someone was working very hard to ensure that the focus remained on David Kellerman and his supporters, rather than on whoever had actually committed the crimes. "Marshal Henderson," the judge said carefully, "these documents appear to be in order, but I notice they're quite specific about the scope of your investigation. They authorize you to investigate obstruction of justice, but not to reopen the original criminal case. May I ask whether you've been instructed to limit your inquiry in that way?" The question was brilliant, because it forced the marshal to either admit that his investigation was artificially limited, or to claim broader authority than his documents actually granted. Marshal Henderson's hesitation before answering revealed that Judge Reed had identified a significant weakness in the federal position. "Judge Reed, our primary responsibility is to locate and apprehend David Kellerman, who is a fugitive from federal justice. Any other matters that arise during the course of that investigation will be handled according to appropriate procedures." It was an evasive answer that confirmed what everyone had suspected. The federal investigation was designed to prevent, not facilitate, discovery of the truth about the original crimes. Colonel Morrison, who had apparently returned from his ranch while the confrontation was developing, chose this moment to make his entrance. The colonel's arrival was significant not just because of his personal authority within the community, but because he was accompanied by 6 of his most trusted hands. Men whose loyalty to their employer was absolute, and whose competence with weapons was well known throughout the territory. "Marshal Henderson," the colonel said with the courtesy due to federal authority, but without any suggestion of intimidation. "I understand you're investigating criminal activity in our community. As the largest employer in this area, I want to assure you of my complete cooperation. But I also want to make sure that your investigation doesn't disrupt the legitimate business activities that keep this community functioning." The colonel's message was polite but clear. He was prepared to defend the community's interests against federal overreach, and he had the resources to make that defense effective if it became necessary. The confrontation had now evolved beyond a simple law enforcement action. It had become a test of competing authorities: federal versus local, official versus informal, institutional versus personal. The outcome would determine not just David Kellerman's fate, but the future character of frontier communities throughout the territory. Marshal Henderson looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who had clearly chosen sides in a conflict that was larger than any individual case. He was experienced enough to recognize when law enforcement had lost the initiative, when community resistance had reached the point where aggressive action was more likely to provoke violence than to produce cooperation. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said finally, "we'll be conducting interviews with community members over the next several days. I trust that everyone will make themselves available to assist with our investigation." It wasn't quite a retreat, but it was a recognition that the federal authorities couldn't simply impose their will on a community that was prepared to resist. The interviews would provide opportunities to gather information, but they would also provide opportunities for the community to demonstrate its solidarity and commitment to protecting David Kellerman. After the marshals departed, the room remained tense for several minutes. Everyone understood that the first round of the confrontation had been inconclusive, which meant that subsequent rounds were likely to be more dangerous. Maggie was the first to break the silence. "We need to get word to David and the others that federal marshals are now involved. This changes everything, because it means the conspiracy reaches higher into the territorial government than we initially suspected." Colonel Morrison nodded grimly. "I'll send Carlos a message through the usual channels, but we also need to consider the possibility that this community is going to become a battleground, and that some of us might not survive what's coming." It was a sobering thought, but it was also a realistic assessment of the situation they had created for themselves. By choosing to resist federal authority in defense of what they believed to be justice, they had committed themselves to a course of action that could end in tragedy for everyone involved. But as the conversation continued, as plans were made and contingencies discussed, as people faced the prospect of losing everything they had worked to build, something else became clear as well. The community that had grown up around the Lone Star Saloon had discovered something about itself that none of them had fully understood before. They were willing to risk everything for principles that mattered more than personal safety or individual prosperity. They had become, in other words, exactly the kind of people who could build a civilization worth defending. But first, they had to survive the test that civilization was about to face. Chapter 6. When the music stops and the truth begins. Evening brought with it the kind of stillness that settles over frontier towns, when everyone understands that trouble is coming, but nobody knows exactly when or from which direction. The Lone Star should have been filled with its usual crowd of cowboys, miners, and travelers seeking good food, strong drink, and companionable conversation. Instead, it held perhaps half the normal number of customers, and those who had come seemed more interested in watching the doors than in socializing. The federal marshals had spent the afternoon conducting their promised interviews, visiting homes and businesses throughout Millerville with the methodical thoroughness of men who understood that information was the most valuable weapon in their arsenal. They had been polite, but persistent, official, but intimidating, and they had succeeded in making it clear to everyone that cooperation with their investigation was not optional. But they had also discovered something that clearly frustrated them. The community's story was remarkably consistent. Everyone agreed that David Kellerman had been a regular customer at the Lone Star, that he had always conducted himself as a law-abiding citizen, and that his reputation for honesty and integrity was without blemish. They also agreed that while he had indeed visited the saloon on the night in question, no one could recall any suspicious conversations or unusual behavior. It was exactly the kind of coordinated response that suggested either remarkable honesty or careful preparation. The marshals clearly suspected the latter, but suspicion without proof was merely frustration. As the evening progressed and the interviews concluded, Marshal Henderson and his men established themselves at a table in the Lone Star's main room, positioning themselves where they could observe everyone who entered or departed, while making it clear that federal authority was now a permanent presence in the community's social life. The effect on the saloon's atmosphere was profound. Conversations were more guarded, laughter was muted, and the usual easy interaction between customers and staff was replaced by a cautious formality that satisfied no one. Jimmy Kelligan still played his piano, but his usual repertoire of lively dance tunes and sentimental ballads was replaced by quieter, more subdued melodies that reflected the room's somber mood. Even the music seemed to understand that this was a time for vigilance rather than celebration. It was during this tense interlude that an unexpected visitor arrived. Unexpected not because no one knew who he was, but because his presence suggested that the conflict was about to escalate in ways that no one had anticipated. The man who walked through the Lone Star's swinging doors at precisely 8 o'clock was tall, lean, and carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that marked him as someone accustomed to command. His clothes were well-made but practical. His weapons were worn with the casual ease of long familiarity, and his eyes held the kind of intelligence that missed nothing and forgot less. But what really set him apart was the reaction his arrival provoked. Marshal Henderson half rose from his chair before, settling back down with obvious reluctance. Judge Reed nodded with the kind of respectful recognition reserved for old colleagues. Even Maggie, who prided herself on maintaining her composure in all circumstances, paused in her work to study the newcomer with obvious interest. The stranger approached the bar, ordered whiskey, and paid with a gold coin that caught the lamplight as he placed it on the polished surface. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud to be heard clearly throughout the room. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'm Captain James McCready, formerly of the Texas Rangers, currently working as a special investigator for the Territorial Governor's Office. I believe you've been expecting me." The statement was delivered as fact rather than question, which suggested that Captain McCready's arrival was part of a plan that had been set in motion days or weeks earlier. But whose plan and what it portended remained to be seen. Maggie's response was carefully neutral. "Captain McCready, you're welcome at the Lone Star, as all travelers are. But I'm afraid I don't know what you mean about expecting you." McCready's smile suggested that he appreciated the careful precision of her answer. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, 3 days ago, Judge Reed sent a telegram to the Territorial Governor requesting clarification of federal jurisdiction in cases involving suspected railroad crimes. Yesterday, Colonel Morrison sent a similar telegram expressing concern about the scope and authority of federal investigations in his area. This morning, Dr. Mitchell sent a message requesting emergency medical supplies for what he described as anticipated casualties resulting from civil unrest." He paused to sip his whiskey before continuing. "When 3 respected citizens in the same community send messages to the territorial capital within 72 hours, all expressing concern about the same federal investigation, it tends to attract official attention." Judge Reed leaned forward with obvious interest. "Captain McCready, are you saying that the territorial government is prepared to intervene in this matter?" Judge Reed: "I'm saying that the territorial government is very interested in ensuring that federal investigations are conducted according to proper procedures and within appropriate jurisdictional boundaries. There have been irregularities in several recent cases that suggest some federal officials may be exceeding their legitimate authority." The implications of McCready's statement were enormous. If the territorial government was prepared to challenge federal authority in the Kellerman case, it meant that the conflict had risen to a level where political considerations outweighed law enforcement concerns. But it also meant that the stakes had increased dramatically, because conflicts between territorial and federal authority had a way of escalating beyond anyone's ability to control them. Marshal Henderson, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, finally decided that he could no longer remain silent. "Captain McCready, I don't know what kind of misinformation you've been given, but I can assure you that all federal activities in this jurisdiction are being conducted according to proper procedures and with full legal authority." McCready turned to study the federal marshal with the kind of attention usually reserved for suspects in criminal cases. "Marshal Henderson, I'm sure you believe that to be true, but I've been reviewing the paperwork authorizing your investigation, and I found several anomalies that suggest your orders may not originate from the sources you've been told they represent." The captain produced a leather portfolio and extracted several documents, which he spread across the bar for everyone to see. "For example, your warrant for David Kellerman's arrest is signed by Federal Judge Morrison, but Judge Morrison has been dead for 6 weeks. Your authorization for investigating suspected conspiracy is dated 3 days before the original robbery occurred. And your jurisdictional authority cites a federal statute that was repealed 2 years ago." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Everyone in the room understood that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. A territorial official accusing federal marshals of operating under fraudulent authority. Marshal Henderson's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "Captain McCready, those are very serious accusations. I hope you're prepared to substantiate them." "Marshal Henderson, I'm prepared to do more than substantiate them. I'm prepared to place you and your men under arrest for impersonating federal officers, falsifying government documents, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." The confrontation had escalated from political disagreement to criminal charges in less than 5 minutes. But instead of producing the dramatic showdown that such moments usually generated in frontier communities, McCready's revelation had an entirely different effect. It convinced everyone present that the conspiracy they had suspected was far more complex and dangerous than any of them had imagined. If federal marshals could be impersonated convincingly enough to fool local authorities, if government documents could be forged with sufficient skill to pass casual inspection, if federal judges could be murdered and their deaths concealed long enough for criminals to use their authority posthumously, then the criminal enterprise they were fighting had resources and connections that reached into the highest levels of territorial and federal government. Judge Reed was the first to recover from the shock of these revelations. "Captain McCready, if what you're saying is true, then we're not dealing with a simple case of mistaken identity or overzealous prosecution. We're dealing with something that threatens the entire structure of legal authority in this territory." McCready nodded grimly. "Judge Reed, that's exactly what we're dealing with. And it's why the territorial governor has authorized me to take whatever measures are necessary to restore legitimate legal authority and bring the actual perpetrators to justice." The fake Marshal Henderson made one last attempt to maintain his charade. "Captain McCready, even if there are irregularities in our documentation, David Kellerman remains a wanted fugitive who should be apprehended and returned for trial." It was Captain McCready's response that finally made clear just how deep the conspiracy really went. "The man you know as David Kellerman isn't actually named David Kellerman. His real name is David Morrison, and he's been working as an undercover investigator for the Territorial Attorney General's office for the past 8 months. The robbery at Mill Creek Junction wasn't a crime. It was a carefully planned operation designed to identify and expose the criminal conspiracy that's been systematically looting railroad payroll shipments throughout the territory." The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. David Kellerman, David Morrison, wasn't a framed innocent man fleeing false accusations. He was a law enforcement officer conducting a complex undercover investigation, and everyone who had been trying to protect him had actually been helping to maintain the cover story that made his investigation possible. But it also meant that everyone in the Lone Star had been drawn into a law enforcement operation without their knowledge or consent, and that their community had become a battlefield in a larger war between legitimate authority and criminal conspiracy. Maggie was the first to find her voice. "Captain McCready, are you saying that everything that's happened here has been part of some kind of official investigation?" "Not everything, Mrs. O'Sullivan. Your decision to help someone you believed to be an innocent man falsely accused was entirely genuine. And it's exactly the kind of moral courage that makes communities like this worth defending. But yes, David's presence here was part of a larger investigation designed to identify and neutralize a criminal conspiracy that threatens law enforcement throughout the territory. The implications were staggering. The community's decision to resist federal authority hadn't been misguided idealism. It had been an instinctive recognition that something was wrong with the official version of events. Their willingness to risk everything to protect an innocent man had actually been part of exposing criminals who had infiltrated the highest levels of law enforcement. But it also raised disturbing questions about how much they still didn't know, and how many other people might be playing roles in a drama whose full scope remained hidden from ordinary citizens. Colonel Morrison asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Captain McCready, how do we know that you're actually who you claim to be? If federal marshals can be impersonated, if government documents can be forged, if dead judges can issue warrants, then how do we know that you're not just another layer of deception?" It was a fair question, and McCready's response demonstrated why the territorial governor had chosen him for this assignment. "Colonel Morrison, you don't know, and you shouldn't trust me just because I claim to represent legitimate authority. But I can give you information that you can verify independently, and I can take actions that will demonstrate whether my authority is real or fabricated." He turned to address the fake marshals who had been listening to this exchange with growing desperation. "Henderson, or whatever your real name is, you and your men are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent, but I doubt you'll choose to exercise that right, because the people you're working for aren't known for their loyalty to subordinates who get captured." What happened next unfolded with the kind of speed and violence that reminded everyone present that frontier life, for all its moments of peace and community, remained fundamentally dangerous. The fake Henderson grabbed for his weapon, clearly intending to shoot his way out of a situation that had become untenable. But his movement was anticipated by Captain McCready, whose own draw was faster and more accurate than anything the imposter could manage. Henderson's shot went wide, shattering a whiskey bottle behind the bar and sending glass fragments across the room. McCready's shot found its target, dropping the fake marshal with a wound that was incapacitating but not fatal. The fake Deputy Crawford attempted to use the confusion to escape through the front door, but his path was blocked by Colonel Morrison and two of his men, who had positioned themselves to prevent exactly such an attempt. The third imposter, Porter the bounty hunter, made the most dangerous choice of all. He grabbed Sarah Martinez, pressing a gun to her head and backing toward the rear exit while shouting threats and demands for safe passage. For a moment that seemed to last hours, everyone in the room faced the classic frontier dilemma: how to respond to violence without becoming something you despised, how to defend the innocent without destroying the civility that made community possible. It was Tom Phillips who resolved the crisis, using skills he'd developed during his military service to disable Porter with a thrown knife that struck with enough force to break his grip on Sarah without causing fatal injury. The one-armed bartender's precision and timing were perfect, the kind of life-saving competence that made him exactly the right person to be working in a place where violence was always a possibility. When the dust settled, 3 criminals were in custody. One, community, had discovered that it possessed reserves of courage and competence that none of them had fully appreciated, and everyone present understood that they had just witnessed the climax of an investigation that had been months in the making. But they also understood that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, because the criminals who had been captured were clearly subordinates in an organization whose leadership remained hidden and whose plans were still unfolding. Captain McCready, after ensuring that the wounded were receiving proper medical attention and that the prisoners were securely restrained, gathered everyone in the Lone Star for an explanation that would make clear just how deep the conspiracy really went. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what you've witnessed tonight is the culmination of an investigation that began 8 months ago, when the Territorial Attorney General's office received reports of systematic corruption in railroad security operations throughout Texas and the surrounding territories." He paused to let that sink in before continuing. The investigation revealed that a criminal organization had infiltrated multiple levels of law enforcement, using their positions to facilitate robberies while framing innocent security personnel to misdirect official investigations. The organization's resources included forged federal documents, impersonated federal officials, corrupted local law enforcement, and a network of informants and assassins that extended throughout the territory. Judge Reed leaned forward with the intense interest of someone whose entire worldview was being reconstructed. "Captain McCready, how extensive was this criminal infiltration?" Judge Reed, "We believe the organization was responsible for at least 12 major robberies over an 18-month period, resulting in the theft of more than $500,000 in railroad, payroll, money, mining, company funds, and territorial tax collections. But more than that, they were systematically destroying public confidence in law enforcement by ensuring that investigations focused on innocent scapegoats rather than actual perpetrators. The scope of the crimes was breathtaking, but what really struck everyone present was the realization that they had been living in a world where the fundamental institutions of law and order had been compromised by criminal conspiracy." Maggie asked the question that went to the heart of everyone's concerns. "Captain McCready, how do we know this is really over? How do we know that there aren't other criminals still in positions of authority, still planning additional crimes?" "Mrs. O'Sullivan, we don't know that. And that's why David Morrison's investigation is still continuing. Tonight's arrests have eliminated one cell of the organization, but we believe there are others, and we believe the leadership is still intact and still dangerous." The implication was clear. The community that had gathered around the Lone Star Saloon was still in danger because they had become witnesses to criminal activities that powerful people wanted to keep secret. But it was also clear that they had proven themselves capable of rising to challenges that tested everything they believed about courage, loyalty, and the price of doing the right thing. As the evening wound down, as statements were taken and prisoners were prepared for transport to territorial custody, as people began to process the implications of what they had experienced, the Lone Star gradually returned to something resembling its normal atmosphere. Jimmy Kelligan returned to his piano, playing the kind of gentle melodies that helped people recover from shock and trauma. Sarah Martinez resumed her duties, serving coffee and food to people who needed comfort after confronting violence and uncertainty. Tom Phillips cleaned up the broken glass and bullet holes with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that life had to continue even after dramatic interruptions. But everyone understood that something fundamental had changed. The Lone Star wasn't just a saloon anymore. It was a place where ordinary people had faced extraordinary challenges and discovered reserves of character they hadn't known they possessed. It was a place where democracy had been tested and had proven strong enough to survive the test. And it was a place where stories would be told for generations about the night when a frontier community chose justice over safety, truth over convenience, and courage over the easy path of looking the other way, when authority proved corrupt. As you finally prepared to leave the Lone Star in the early hours of morning, you found yourself thinking about the larger lessons of what you had witnessed. Frontier saloons like the Lone Star weren't just businesses or entertainment venues. They were laboratories where American democracy was tested and refined, where the relationship between individual conscience and collective responsibility was worked out through practical experience rather than abstract theory. They were places where the future was being created, not through grand gestures or heroic speeches, but through the accumulated decisions of ordinary people who understood that civilization was something they had to build and defend themselves, one choice at a time. And they were reminders that the price of freedom and justice wasn't paid once and forgotten, but had to be paid again and again by people who were willing to risk everything they had built for principles that mattered more than personal safety or individual prosperity. The sun was rising over Millerville, Texas, painting the dusty streets and wooden buildings in the warm gold of early morning light. The Lone Star Saloon stood quiet now, its doors closed, its customers departed, its staff finally able to rest after a night that had tested everyone's limits. But the stories that had been made within those walls would live on, growing and changing with each telling, until they became part of the larger story of how the American West was really won, not by gunfighters and outlaws, but by people who understood that the most important battles were fought not in the streets, but in the human heart, where courage wrestled with fear, where principle confronted convenience, and where ordinary people discovered they were capable of extraordinary things when the stakes were high enough and the cause was just. Chapter 7. The Long Shadow of Dawn. 3 weeks had passed since the night of revelations at the Lone Star, and Millerville had settled into a new rhythm, one marked by the kind of cautious optimism that comes after surviving a crisis, but before knowing whether the danger has truly passed. The fake federal marshals had been transported to the territorial capital, where their trials would eventually expose the full scope of the criminal conspiracy they had served. Captain McCready had departed to coordinate similar investigations in other communities, leaving behind a sense that justice was finally being served, however belatedly. But the most significant change was the return of David Morrison, the man they had all known as David Kellerman, to his role as a visible member of the community, rather than a hunted fugitive hiding in the desert. David's transformation from wanted criminal to undercover law enforcement officer had required some adjustment from everyone involved. The man they had risked everything to protect turned out to be someone who hadn't needed their protection, at least not in the way they had understood it. But he had needed something else that was perhaps more important. He had needed a community that would choose to do the right thing even when the cost was potentially devastating. This morning, as you sat at your familiar table in the Lone Star, watching the interplay of characters who had become as familiar as family over the past month, you could see how the events of recent weeks had changed everyone in subtle but significant ways. Maggie moved through her routines with the same competent efficiency as always, but there was a new authority in her bearing. The confidence of someone who had been tested under extreme pressure and had proven equal to the challenge. She had discovered that running a frontier saloon required not just business skills, but leadership qualities that could hold a community together when everything else was falling apart. Tom Phillips still worked behind the bar with his characteristic methodical precision, but the events of that climactic night had revealed depths of capability that surprised even those who knew him best. The one-armed bartender who had disabled an armed criminal with a thrown knife had demonstrated that physical limitations were no barrier to moral courage when the situation demanded action. Sarah Martinez continued to serve customers with her usual warmth and efficiency, but her experience as a hostage had added a new dimension to her understanding of how quickly safety could transform into danger on the frontier. She had learned that survival required not just kindness and hospitality, but the kind of alertness that came from understanding that violence was always a possibility in a world where law enforcement was imperfect and justice was often improvised. Even Jimmy Kelligan, the piano player whose music provided the soundtrack for the Lone Star's daily life, had been changed by his proximity to events that could have destroyed the community he served. His melodies had acquired a new complexity, still beautiful and comforting, but with undertones that acknowledge both the fragility and the resilience of the human connections that made civilization possible. The regular customers had also been affected by their participation in events that had revealed the difference between abstract, moral principles and the concrete choices that real people faced when those principles were tested. Colonel Morrison had discovered that his wealth and status carried responsibilities that extended beyond his immediate business interests. Judge Reed had learned that legal authority was only as valid as the moral courage of the people who exercised it. Dr. Mitchell had been reminded that healing involved not just treating physical injuries, but helping communities recover from the trauma of betrayal and violence. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationship between David Morrison and Catherine Morrison, who, as it turned out, were not just former colleagues and lovers, but were actually engaged to be married, a fact that had been concealed as part of maintaining David's undercover identity. Their reunion, played out in full view of the Lone Star's community, had provided a kind of emotional resolution to events that might otherwise have left everyone feeling confused about the difference between reality and performance, between genuine relationships and roles adopted for investigative purposes. "The thing that bothers me," Catherine was saying as she sat across from David at a table near the window, "isn't that you had to lie to me about your identity. I understand why the investigation required that level of secrecy. What bothers me is that these people were willing to risk everything to protect someone they barely knew, while I was so caught up in official procedures that I almost let you face this alone." David reached across the table to take her hand, a gesture that was both intimate and public, a declaration that their relationship was no longer constrained by the requirements of his undercover role. "Catherine, you didn't almost let me face this alone. You were conducting your own investigation, following your own leads, taking your own risks. The fact that we were working from different directions doesn't mean we weren't working together." He paused, looking around the room at the people who had become far more than just his cover story. "And besides, I wasn't alone here. These people didn't help me because they knew I was a law enforcement officer. They helped me because they believed I was innocent of the crimes I was accused of, and because they thought defending an innocent man was worth the risk. That's not something you can fake or manipulate. That's the real character of this community." Judge Reed, who had been reading a newspaper at a nearby table, looked up with obvious interest in the conversation. "David, there's something I've been wondering about since we learned your real identity. When you first arrived in Millerville, did you know that this community would respond the way it did? Was their willingness to help part of your operational plan?" David's answer revealed something important about both his character and his understanding of frontier communities. "Judge Reed, I hoped that if my cover was blown, I would find people who cared more about justice than about their own safety. But I couldn't know for sure because that kind of moral courage can't be predicted or manufactured. It has to be real, and it has to be freely chosen." He gestured toward the bar where Tom Phillips was methodically polishing glasses while keeping one eye on the room's conversations. Tom didn't throw that knife to save Sarah because he was following some script I had written. He did it because it was the right thing to do in that moment, and because he had the skills and courage to act on that judgment. Same with everyone else who took risks to protect someone they thought was an innocent man being persecuted by corrupt authority. Maggie, who had been listening while managing the morning's business, approached their table with fresh coffee and her own perspective on the events they were discussing. David, or I suppose I should get used to calling you David Morrison instead of David Kellerman, there's something I want you to understand. When we decided to help you, we weren't just helping one person. We were defending the principle that this community stands for something more than just individual survival. She set the coffee cups down and settled into an empty chair, her expression thoughtful. Every frontier community faces the same choice. Sooner or later, do we become the kind of place where people look out for each other? Where justice matters more than convenience? Where doing the right thing is worth the cost? Or do we become the kind of place where everyone's only concerned with their own safety? Where authority is never questioned? Where good people stand aside and let bad things happen because getting involved is too dangerous? David nodded, understanding the deeper implications of what she was saying. And by choosing to help me, you were really choosing what kind of community you wanted to be. Exactly. Which is why it doesn't matter that you turned out to be a law enforcement officer instead of a fugitive. What matters is that we made the choice to help someone we believed was being treated unjustly, and that choice revealed something about ourselves that we might never have discovered otherwise. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Carlos Reyes, who had returned from his latest scouting expedition with news that would prove the conspiracy was far from over. "We have visitors coming," he announced quietly, his ability to move unnoticed through the saloon allowing him to deliver sensitive information without attracting unwanted attention. 3 riders, approaching from the east, moving carefully and staying off the main road. They'll be here within the hour. David's expression immediately shifted from relaxed conversation to professional alertness. "What kind of riders, Carlos? Law enforcement? More fake marshals? Or something else?" "Something else," Carlos replied. "These men aren't wearing uniforms or badges, but they're armed like people who expect trouble. And they're taking the kind of precautions that suggest they don't want to be seen arriving." The implications were clear to everyone who heard this report. The arrests of 3 weeks earlier had eliminated one cell of the criminal conspiracy, but they hadn't eliminated the organization itself. And now that organization was apparently sending representatives to deal with the community that had helped expose their operation. Captain McCready had warned them that this might happen. Criminal organizations of the scope they were fighting didn't simply abandon their plans when individual operations were compromised. They adapted, regrouped, and often responded to setbacks with increased violence designed to discourage future resistance. Judge Reed stood up, his legal mind immediately grasping the strategic implications of the situation. "David, if these men are coming here to retaliate against people who helped with your investigation, then this community is about to become a battlefield again. Do we have any kind of official support available?" David's answer was both reassuring and sobering. Captain McCready left 2 of his men stationed in the area, but they're positioned to observe and report rather than to engage in direct confrontation. If these visitors turn out to be hostile, we'll be largely on our own until reinforcements can arrive. Colonel Morrison, who had just entered the saloon for his usual morning coffee, absorbed this information with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to making tactical decisions under pressure. "How many people in town know about David's real identity and role in the investigation?" he asked. "Everyone who was here during the confrontation 3 weeks ago," Maggie replied, "plus a few others who needed to know for operational reasons. Maybe 20 people total. And how many of those people have families or responsibilities that would prevent them from participating in defensive operations?" It was a harsh question, but a necessary one. In a frontier community, everyone understood that sometimes survival required hard choices about who could be asked to fight and who needed to be protected. Dr. Mitchell, who had been quietly assessing the medical implications of what might be coming, added his own concerns to the discussion. "If we're looking at potential violence, I need to know how many people we might be dealing with, what kind of weapons they're likely to have, and whether we have secure locations where non-combatants can take shelter." The conversation was taking on the character of a military briefing, which reflected the reality that the Lone Star community was preparing for what might essentially be a small-scale war between legitimate citizens and criminal organizations that had infiltrated official law enforcement. It was Sarah Martinez who raised the question that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to voice directly. "Are we sure we want to fight? I mean, these people have already proven they're willing to commit murder to protect their operation. Maybe it would be safer to just cooperate with whatever they want." The silence that followed her question was profound, because everyone understood that she was asking whether their commitment to justice and community solidarity was strong enough to sustain them when the cost might be lives rather than just property or reputation. It was Tom Phillips who provided the answer, speaking with the quiet authority of someone whose military service had taught him the difference between courage and recklessness. "Sarah, I understand the temptation to avoid a fight that we might not win. But there's something you need to consider. These people aren't just criminals. They're criminals who have been systematically destroying trust in law enforcement throughout the territory. If we give in to them now, if we let them intimidate us into silence or cooperation, we're not just abandoning our principles. We're helping them destroy the possibility of justice for anyone else who might stand up to them in the future." He paused, his one hand continuing to polish a glass with automatic efficiency while his mind worked through the implications of what he was saying. "Sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones you're likely to win. Sometimes they're the ones that need to be fought regardless of the odds, because not fighting means accepting a world where good people have to live in fear and bad people operate with impunity." David Morrison stood up, his transformation from undercover fugitive to acknowledged law enforcement officer now complete in the eyes of everyone present. "Tom's right. But I also want everyone to understand exactly what we're dealing with here. The organization we exposed 3 weeks ago has resources that extend throughout the territorial government, and possibly into federal agencies as well. They've proven they're willing to commit murder, forge official documents, and corrupt law enforcement to protect their operations. If they've sent people here to eliminate witnesses or to retaliate against community leaders, those people will be professionals who won't hesitate to kill anyone who gets in their way." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present. "I'm not going to ask anyone to take risks they're not prepared for. If anyone wants to leave town until this situation resolves itself, I'll understand completely. If anyone wants to cooperate with these visitors to protect their families or their property, I won't judge them for making that choice. But if you decide to stay and fight, I need you to understand that we're not playing games here. This is life and death, and the people we're fighting don't recognize any rules except power and fear." The room remained quiet for several minutes as people absorbed the implications of what they were being asked to consider. Then, one by one, they began to speak. Colonel Morrison was first. I've spent 30 years building something in this territory, not just a ranch, but a community where people can live with dignity and security. I'm not going to let criminals destroy that just because fighting them involves risk. Judge Reed was next. I've devoted my entire career to the principle that law and justice are the foundations of civilization. If I abandon that principle now, when it's being tested by people who want to replace justice with corruption, then everything I've worked for becomes meaningless. Dr. Mitchell followed. I took an oath to protect life and health. That doesn't just mean treating injuries after violence occurs. It means preventing violence when possible and opposing the kind of systematic criminality that makes entire communities sick with fear and mistrust. Maggie's statement was characteristically direct. This is my place, built with my sweat and defended by my choices. If criminals think they can intimidate me into abandoning everything I've created, they're about to discover how wrong they are. One by one, others voiced their commitment to defending the community and the principles it represented, not because they were eager for violence or confident of victory, but because they understood that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. But even as they committed themselves to resistance, everyone understood that they were taking an enormous gamble. They were betting that their impromptu militia could defeat professional criminals, that their moral courage could overcome superior firepower, and that their cause was just enough to sustain them through whatever horrors might be coming. Carlos Reyes, who had been monitoring the approaching riders, returned with an update that made the situation even more complicated. "They've stopped about a mile outside town," he reported. Looks like they're waiting for something. Maybe reinforcements, maybe just waiting for dark, maybe trying to decide on their approach. But there's something else you should know. One of the riders is a woman, and she's dressed like someone with authority. Not like the kind of person who usually does the dirty work for criminal organizations. This information changed the tactical situation significantly. A woman in a position of authority might be there to negotiate rather than to fight, which could provide opportunities for resolving the situation without violence. But it could also be a more sophisticated form of deception, a way to get close enough to inflict maximum damage while the community's defenders were off guard. David Morrison's response reflected his professional training in dealing with complex and potentially deceptive criminal operations. We prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Everyone who's committed to fighting needs to be armed and positioned where they can respond quickly if violence breaks out. But we also need to be prepared for the possibility that these visitors are here to negotiate, and that we might be able to resolve the situation through discussion rather than gunfire. Judge Reed added his own perspective. If they are here to negotiate, we need to be very careful about what terms we're willing to accept. Sometimes criminals offer deals that look reasonable, but are actually designed to neutralize opposition while preserving their ability to continue their criminal activities. As the afternoon wore on, preparations continued throughout the community. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, defensive positions were established, and non-combatants were moved to secure locations. But conversation also continued, because everyone understood that they might be spending their last peaceful hours together, and there were things that needed to be said. Catherine Morrison, who had remained largely quiet during the tactical discussions, finally voiced concerns that reflected her unique position as both a participant in recent events and an outsider to the community that had grown up around the Lone Star. "I keep thinking about what all of this means for the future. Even if we win whatever fight is coming, even if we defeat these criminals and expose their entire organization, what happens next? How does a community recover from being a battleground? How do you go back to normal life after you've had to kill people to defend your principles? It was Father Rodriguez, who had been silent throughout most of the day's discussions, who provided an answer that reflected both his religious perspective and his practical experience with frontier violence. Catherine, communities don't recover from violence by forgetting it happened or by pretending it was someone else's responsibility. They recover by understanding why the violence was necessary, by honoring the people who were willing to fight for justice, and by making sure that the principles they fought for continue to guide the community's choices in the future. He paused, looking around the room at people who had become his congregation in the broadest sense of the term. The Lone Star has become more than just a saloon. It's become a symbol of what this community stands for. The idea that ordinary people can create extraordinary things when they're willing to work together and stand up for each other. Whatever happens tonight, that symbol will survive, and the example you've set will inspire other communities facing similar challenges. As evening approached and the time for confrontation drew near, the Lone Star filled with people who understood that they were about to participate in events that would define not just their own futures, but the character of their community for generations to come. The mysterious riders were still positioned outside town, apparently waiting for full darkness before making their move. The community's defenders were as ready as they could be, given their limited resources and improvised organization, and everyone understood that within a few hours, they would know whether their commitment to justice and community solidarity was strong enough to sustain them through the ultimate test of violence. But they also understood something else that was, perhaps, more important. Regardless of the outcome of the coming confrontation, they had already won something significant. They had proven to themselves and to each other that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary courage when the situation demanded it. They had demonstrated that communities could choose to stand together rather than fragment under pressure. And they had shown that the principles of justice and mutual support that made civilization possible were worth defending, even at the cost of everything they had worked to build. The sun was setting over Millerville, Texas, painting the sky in brilliant shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful under other circumstances, but now seemed ominous, like the sky was on fire, presaging the flames that might soon consume everything they had worked to create. But in the Lone Star Saloon, as people made their final preparations and said what might be their last goodbyes, there was also something else in the air, the quiet pride of people who had discovered that they were capable of rising to challenges they never could have imagined, and the unshakable conviction that some things were worth any sacrifice to preserve. The long shadow of dawn was falling across the frontier, and in that shadow, the future of American democracy was being written by people who understood that freedom wasn't something you inherited. It was something you earned, one difficult choice at a time. Chapter 8, Where All Stories End and All Legends Begin. The darkness that settled over Millerville that night was different from any that had come before. It carried with it the weight of anticipation, the electricity of impending confrontation, and the profound silence that falls over communities when everyone understands that the choices made in the next few hours will echo through generations. The Lone Star Saloon had been transformed from a social gathering place into the command center of what military strategists would have recognized as a defensive operation, but it remained, fundamentally, what it had always been, a place where people came together to face whatever challenges the frontier might present, drawing strength from each other and from the shared values that made community possible. The mysterious riders had finally begun their approach to town as full darkness fell. moving with the practiced stealth of people who were accustomed to operating under cover of night. Carlos Reyes, positioned at the edge of town with the enhanced senses that his Apache training had developed, tracked their progress with reports delivered through a network of signals that had been improvised but proved remarkably effective. 3 riders, as originally reported, moving slowly and carefully, but directly toward the center of town, armed, but not making any obvious preparations for immediate violence. The woman was clearly in charge, with the 2 men following her lead and deferring to her tactical decisions. Inside the Lone Star, the community's defenders waited with the kind of calm tension that marked experienced people facing uncertain but potentially deadly situations. Weapons were loaded and readily accessible, but concealed well enough to avoid provoking unnecessary confrontation. Defensive positions had been chosen that provided good fields of fire while appearing to be normal seating arrangements. Everyone knew their role, but remained flexible enough to adapt if the situation developed differently than anticipated. David Morrison stood behind the bar, his position allowing him to observe both the front and rear entrances while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation with other customers. His professional training was evident in the way he monitored everyone's positions, tracked potential problems, and maintained overall awareness of tactical developments without appearing to be anything more than another community member enjoying an evening at the local saloon. Judge Reed sat at his usual table near the window, apparently absorbed in legal documents but actually coordinating communications with other community members throughout town. Dr. Mitchell occupied a position that would allow him to reach wounded quickly while remaining protected from initial gunfire. Colonel Morrison and his most trusted hands were distributed throughout the room in positions that provided multiple angles of defensive fire while avoiding crossfire situations. But perhaps most importantly, Maggie O'Sullivan remained behind the bar, serving drinks and managing the establishment's normal operations with the same competent efficiency that had made the Lone Star successful for 8 years. Her presence there, conducting business as usual while prepared for violence, sent a clear message. This community would not be intimidated into abandoning its normal life, regardless of what threats might materialize. At exactly 9 o'clock, the swinging doors opened to admit the 3 mysterious riders. The woman who entered first was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair swept back in a practical style and intelligent eyes that immediately assessed every person and potential threat in the room. Her clothes were well made but designed for travel and hard use rather than fashion. She carried herself with the kind of authority that comes from long experience in positions of command, and her weapons were worn with the casual familiarity of someone who knew how to use them, but didn't feel the need to make threatening displays. Her 2 companions flanked her automatically, their positioning and alertness marking them as professional bodyguards or military personnel. But they made no aggressive moves, keeping their hands visible and away from their weapons while remaining obviously ready to respond to any threat against their leader. The woman approached the bar directly, her manner suggesting someone accustomed to taking charge of situations, but also someone who understood the value of courtesy in potential volatile circumstances. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," she said, her voice carrying the kind of educated accent that marked her as someone from the eastern states, "I'm Elizabeth Hartwell, and I represent certain interests that have been affected by recent events in your community. I'd like to speak with you and with Mr. David Morrison, if that's possible." The fact that she knew David's real name and that she had addressed Maggie by name without being introduced made it clear that she had detailed intelligence about recent events and the people involved in them. But her tone was respectful rather than threatening, and her approach suggested someone who preferred negotiation to violence. Maggie's response was characteristically direct. "Ms. Hartwell, you're welcome to speak, but I want to make it clear that this is a public establishment where all conversations can be overheard by everyone present. If you're looking for privacy, you might want to consider a different venue." Elizabeth Hartwell smiled, and her expression suggested genuine appreciation for Maggie's straightforward approach. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I actually prefer public conversations when dealing with matters that affect entire communities. Privacy often breeds suspicion, and suspicion can lead to unnecessary violence." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present before returning her attention to Maggie and David. "I represent a consortium of business interests that have been significantly affected by the recent disruption of certain informal arrangements that had been operating throughout this territory. Those arrangements are no longer viable, and my employers are prepared to accept that reality. But they're also concerned about preventing further disruptions that might affect legitimate business operations." It was a carefully phrased statement that acknowledged the collapse of the criminal conspiracy, without explicitly admitting that such a conspiracy had ever existed. But it also suggested that the organization behind recent events was prepared to negotiate an end to hostilities rather than escalating to more serious violence. David Morrison stepped forward, his law enforcement training evident in the way he evaluated both the offer being made and the person making it. "Ms. Hartwell, I appreciate your employer's interest in avoiding further disruption, but I need to understand exactly what kind of arrangement you're proposing and what assurances you can provide that this community won't face retaliation for cooperating with legitimate law enforcement activities." Elizabeth Hartwell's answer revealed both the sophistication of the criminal organization and the extent to which recent events had damaged their operations. "Mr. Morrison, my employers recognize that their previous methods of operation are no longer sustainable. The arrests of 3 weeks ago have compromised key personnel and exposed operational procedures that can no longer be used effectively. Rather than attempting to rebuild those operations, they're prepared to withdraw entirely from this territory and focus their activities in regions where law enforcement is less vigilant." She paused, allowing everyone present to absorb the implications of what she was saying. In exchange for that withdrawal, they're asking for 2 things. First, they want assurance that information gathered during recent investigations will not be shared with law enforcement agencies in other territories where their operations might continue. Second, they want the return of certain assets that were seized during those investigations but haven't yet been turned over to territorial authorities. Judge Reed leaned forward with obvious interest in the legal implications of what was being proposed. "Ms. Hartwell, are you asking this community to help conceal criminal activity in other jurisdictions? Because, if so, I need to point out that such an arrangement would make us accessories to whatever crimes your employers might commit in the future." Elizabeth Hartwell's response demonstrated why her employers had chosen her as their negotiator. "Judge Reed, I'm not asking anyone to conceal criminal activity. I'm simply suggesting that information about investigative techniques and operational procedures shouldn't be shared unnecessarily with other jurisdictions, where it might compromise legitimate law enforcement activities that are still in progress." It was a subtle distinction, but an important one. She was asking for operational security rather than criminal conspiracy, which put her request in a legal gray area where cooperation might be possible without violating ethical principles. But Colonel Morrison raised the question that everyone was thinking. "Ms. Hartwell, what happens if we refuse your employer's request? Are you here to negotiate, or are you here to deliver an ultimatum backed by threats of violence?" Elizabeth Hartwell's answer would determine whether the evening ended in negotiation or gunfire. "Colonel Morrison, I'm here to negotiate a mutually acceptable resolution to a situation that has become problematic for everyone involved. My employers have no interest in violence for its own sake. Violence is expensive, unpredictable, and tends to attract the kind of official attention that's bad for any kind of business operation. She gestured toward her two companions, who remained alert, but non-threatening. These gentlemen are here to ensure my safety during these negotiations, not to intimidate anyone into accepting terms they find unacceptable. If we can't reach an agreement tonight, I'll return to my employers with that information, and they'll make their own decisions about how to proceed. But I hope we can find terms that allow everyone to move forward without further conflict. It was Tom Phillips who asked the question that went to the heart of everyone's concerns. Ms. Hartwell, how do we know your employers will honor whatever agreement we reach? How do we know they won't just wait for things to calm down and then come back with a different approach? Elizabeth Hartwell's answer provided insight into both her character and the nature of the organization she represented. Mr. Phillips, you don't know that, and I can't provide guarantees that would satisfy someone who's determined to be suspicious. What I can tell you is that my employers are practical people who understand that continued conflict with this community would be more expensive than any possible benefits they might gain from revenge or retaliation. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. But I can also tell you that if these negotiations fail, if this community continues to cooperate with law enforcement investigations that threaten my employer's operations in other territories, then practical considerations might not be enough to prevent more aggressive responses. The threat was delivered quietly and politely, but it was unmistakably a threat. The criminal organization was prepared to negotiate, but it was also prepared to use violence if negotiation failed to protect their interests. David Morrison, drawing on his experience with similar situations, decided to test the limits of what Elizabeth Hartwell was authorized to offer. Ms. Hartwell, let's assume we're willing to consider your employer's request. What specific assurances can you provide about their withdrawal from this territory? How do we know they won't simply change their methods and continue operating here under different arrangements? Elizabeth Hartwell reached into her coat and produced a document that she placed on the bar where everyone could see it. This is a detailed inventory of assets and operations that my employers are prepared to abandon as part of their withdrawal from this territory. Banking relationships, real estate holdings, personnel contracts, supply agreements, everything that would be necessary to resume operations here. She allowed everyone to examine the document, which was impressively comprehensive and appeared to represent genuine intelligence about criminal operations rather than fabricated information designed to mislead investigators. If my employers violate the terms of any agreement we reach, this information would provide law enforcement with everything necessary to identify and prosecute their remaining associates throughout the territory. Judge Reed studied the document with the careful attention of someone trained to evaluate evidence and legal agreements. Ms. Hartwell, this appears to be genuine intelligence, but it's also the kind of information that could be falsified or deliberately incomplete. How do we verify its accuracy? Judge Reed? You verify it by testing it. Use the information to investigate suspected operations, and you'll discover whether it's accurate or not. If it proves to be false or incomplete, then you'll know my employers aren't negotiating in good faith, and you can respond accordingly. It was a reasonable answer, but it also highlighted the fundamental problem with negotiating with criminal organizations. Any agreement depended on trusting people who had already proven themselves untrustworthy. Catherine Morrison, who had been listening to the negotiations with growing frustration, finally voiced the moral objections that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to state directly. Ms. Hartwell, what you're asking us to do is help your employers escape justice in exchange for a promise that they won't commit crimes in our territory anymore. You're asking us to become accessories to whatever crimes they commit elsewhere just to buy our own safety. Elizabeth Hartwell's response revealed why she was effective as a negotiator for criminal organizations. Miss Morrison, I'm asking you to make a practical choice about how to protect the community you've helped build here. My employers are going to continue their operations somewhere with or without any agreement from you. The only question is whether those operations will threaten this community, or whether they'll be conducted far enough away that they don't affect your daily lives. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each person present. You can choose to be heroes who sacrifice everything to fight criminals throughout the territory, or you can choose to be practical people who protect what you've built here while leaving justice in other territories to other people. I'm not asking you to like that choice. I'm just asking you to make it with your eyes open. The silence that followed this statement was profound, because everyone understood that she had framed the choice in terms that made moral absolutes seem naive and impractical. But it was Maggie O'Sullivan who provided the response that defined not just the evening's outcome, but the character of the community that had grown up around the Lone Star Saloon. Ms. Hartwell, I appreciate your employer's interest in avoiding further conflict, and I understand the practical considerations that make their offer attractive. But there's something you need to understand about this community. Maggie moved from behind the bar to the center of the room, positioning herself where she could address everyone present, as well as the three visitors. We didn't help David Morrison because we thought it would be easy or safe or profitable. We helped him because it was the right thing to do, and because we believe that communities are built on principles that matter more than individual convenience or safety. She paused, gathering her thoughts for what everyone sensed would be a defining statement. Your employers can withdraw from this territory or stay and fight. That's their choice to make. But this community isn't going to compromise its principles just to avoid conflict with people who think justice is something that can be negotiated away. One by one, others voiced their agreement with Maggie's position, not because they were eager for continued conflict, but because they understood that accepting the criminal's offer would fundamentally change what their community stood for. Elizabeth Hartwell listened to these responses with what appeared to be genuine respect, even as it became clear that her mission was failing to achieve its objectives. I understand your position, she said finally, and I respect the principles that led you to it. But I hope you also understand the position you're putting my employers in. If this community continues to cooperate with law enforcement investigations that threaten their operations elsewhere, they'll be forced to treat you as ongoing threats to their survival. David Morrison stepped forward, his law enforcement authority now fully revealed and acknowledged by everyone present. Ms. Hartwell, tell your employers that this community will continue to cooperate with legitimate law enforcement activities regardless of any threats they might make. Tell them that we understand the risks, and we've decided that some things are worth fighting for. Elizabeth Hartwell nodded, apparently unsurprised by the rejection of her employer's offer. I'll deliver your message, Mr. Morrison. But I hope you understand that by rejecting this offer, you're choosing a path that leads to continued conflict with people who have significant resources and few moral constraints. She turned to address the room as a whole. I want everyone here to understand what you're choosing. My employers won't simply accept defeat and disappear. They'll adapt their methods, bring in additional resources, and continue to pursue their objectives through whatever means prove necessary. Some of you may not survive the conflict you're choosing to continue. Tom Phillips, who had remained quiet throughout most of the negotiation, finally spoke with the authority of someone whose military experience had taught him the realities of warfare. Ms. Hartwell, we understand what we're choosing. We've faced those risks before, and we're prepared to face them again. What your employers need to understand is that they're not just fighting individuals, they're fighting an entire community that's decided their way of doing business isn't acceptable. Elizabeth Hartwell and her companions departed as quietly as they had arrived, but their visit had clarified the stakes involved in the community's decision to continue resisting criminal intimidation. As the doors swung shut behind them, everyone in the Lone Star understood that they had just committed themselves to a conflict that might continue for years, that might spread to other communities, and that might ultimately cost some of them their lives. But they also understood that they had made the only choice consistent with the principles that made their community worth defending. They had chosen justice over safety, principle over convenience, and collective courage over individual security. In making that choice, they had demonstrated something important about the nature of American democracy. It wasn't something that was established once and then preserved automatically. It was something that had to be chosen again and again by ordinary people facing difficult circumstances, people who understood that freedom and justice were worth whatever they cost to maintain. As the evening progressed and people gradually returned to their homes, as the Lone Star resumed its normal rhythm of quiet conversation and gentle music, everyone carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in something larger than a simple criminal investigation. They had participated in the ongoing creation of American civilization, in the never-ending process by which communities define what they stand for and what they're willing to defend. The frontier was changing, evolving from a lawless wilderness into a network of communities connected by shared values and mutual support. The Lone Star Saloon had become more than just a business or even a social gathering place. It had become a symbol of what those communities could be when ordinary people chose to act with extraordinary courage. But the frontier was also still dangerous, still full of people who preferred taking to building, still requiring the kind of vigilance and determination that had kept communities like Millerville alive during their most vulnerable years. As you finally prepared to leave the Lone Star, as the last customers departed and the staff began their end-of-evening cleanup, you found yourself thinking about the stories that would grow from the events of recent weeks, because that's what frontier saloons were really about, in the end. They were the places where stories were made and stories were told, where the daily struggles of building civilization were transformed into the legends that would inspire future generations. The story of David Morrison's investigation would become a tale of justice, triumphing over corruption, through the courage of ordinary people who refused to look the other way when authority proved corrupt. The story of Maggie O'Sullivan's leadership would become an example of how individuals could build institutions that served entire communities while never losing sight of the human relationships that made those institutions meaningful. The story of the community's decision to resist criminal intimidation would become a reminder that democracy required not just formal procedures, but the moral courage to defend those procedures when they were threatened by people who preferred force to persuasion. And the story of the Lone Star Saloon itself would become a symbol of what the American frontier was really about. Not the romanticized violence of Hollywood westerns, but the patient, difficult work of building communities where people could live with dignity, security, and hope for the future. As dawn broke over Millerville, Texas, painting the dusty streets and wooden buildings in the familiar gold of early morning light. The Lone Star stood ready for another day, another chapter in the ongoing story of how the American West was really won, not by gunfighters or outlaws, but by people who understood that the most important victories were won not on battlefields but in human hearts, where fear wrestled with courage, where selfishness confronted community spirit, and where ordinary people discovered they were capable of extraordinary things when the cause was just and the need was great. The saloon doors stood open to welcome whatever the new day might bring, and within those walls, the eternal work of building and defending civilization would continue, one story at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. Because that's what frontier saloons were really about. They were the places where America discovered what it wanted to be, and where that discovery was tested against the harsh realities of life on the edge of the wilderness. They were the laboratories of democracy, the workshops of community, and the theaters where the greatest stories of the American experience were written not by professional authors, but by ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. And in the end, they were the places where we learned that civilization isn't something that's imposed from above by governments or institutions, but something that grows from below through the accumulated choices of people who understand that some things are worth defending, no matter what they cost. The Texas Saloon, with its swinging doors, its polished bar, its diverse community of dreamers and builders and survivors, remains in our collective memory, not as a relic of a vanished past, but as a reminder of what we're capable of when we choose courage over safety, community over isolation, and justice over convenience. In the gathering twilight of another frontier day, as the lanterns begin to glow and the first notes of piano music drift into the evening air, the Lone Star Saloon stands ready to welcome all who seek not just food and drink and entertainment, but connection to something larger than themselves, to the eternal human story of people who refuse to give up on the possibility that tomorrow might be better than today, if they're willing to work for it and fight for it and believe in it strongly enough. And somewhere in that gentle music, in the warm light spilling from those windows, in the sound of voices raised in laughter and conversation and debate, you can still hear the echo of that most American of questions. What kind of people do we want to be? The answer, written in the dust of countless frontier towns and preserved in the memories of countless frontier saloons, remains as relevant today as it was a century and a half ago. We want to be the kind of people who stand up for each other, who choose justice over expediency, who build communities worth defending, and who never stop believing that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when the stakes are high enough and the cause is just. That's the real story of the Texas Saloon, and it's the story of America itself, still being written, still being tested, still calling us to be better than we thought we could be.